Hey everyone, this is Mason. Welcome back to the HerbRally podcast. Today's episode is a doozy. It is a 3-hour Q&A with herbalist Jim McDonald, and I counted it. I believe it's 85 questions, but we'll go with 80 plus, hence the title. About a month or so ago in the newsletter and on social media, I posed the question to the HerbRally audience: if you could ask your favorite herbalist just one question, what would it be? The goal with that is we're gathering information for an upcoming secret HerbRally project, which we're really excited for. But a lot of you all wanted to know what those questions were, so we published it as a blog post. And yeah, like I said, it was about 80 questions. And as you'll hear in this episode, Jim just took it upon himself to go through each and every question and write out his answers. I read him and I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And as I do, since I love the podcast so much, I said, hey, Jim, what do you think about me recording these answers? And of course, he upped the ante and just said, I'll record the answers. So he reads his answers, but actually what really ends up happening is he goes off script. So we created a blog post around his answers. We're also going to publish this podcast. I'll include links to everything in the show notes today. So if you want to read the answers, you can read them there. But the podcast is really cool because he goes, like I said, he goes off script and he kind of expounds upon his answers even more. So I just feel super honored and blessed that Jim took 3 hours to record this. So thank you so much, Jim. There's so much great information packed into this 3 hours. Whether you're an experienced or new herbalist, there's just a great amount of takeaways. And in fact, a lot of the questions are geared towards beginning herbalists, but no matter what, you're going to be entertained. It's thought-provoking. If you don't know Jim yet, he's super funny, but he's very thoughtful as well. So this is easily one of my favorite episodes HerbRally has ever published, so I can't thank Jim enough for sharing this with all of us. I want to point you in the direction of herbcraft.org. That is Jim McDonald's website. It's where a lot of his free teachings are, including his writings, blog posts, that kind of thing. But then he now has an online apprenticeship. It's called Lindera. And to find that, you could go to herbcraft.podia.com. And you'll learn about his 2022 Herbalism apprenticeship coming up in March. And to take the words right off of Jim's Facebook page, here's what he says. Lindera is a course focused on teaching a way of approaching the use of herbs with an energetic lens. It's much more about the way we think about people, plants, and how we apply their virtues than it is a course about a lot of tidbits of information about plants. Energetics is a qualitative system of herbalism. It's the part of herbalism that actually does treat the person and doesn't suggest the name of a plant for the name of a problem someone has. And he goes, this is Jim, I would love and really be honored to be a part of how you learn about herbs. It'll be informative, it'll be empowering, it'll be fun. So yeah, one more time, check out herbcraft.podia.com, /2022 Lindera. That's too much to remember, so I'm going to include links to that in the show notes, as well as to his regular, his main page, which, just to plug that as well, is an amazing website. One of my favorite articles on Calamus can be found there. In fact, in today's episode, Jim briefly covers Calamus, but if you haven't read his Calamus article, highly recommend that. I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. All right, also before we get into the show, I want to tell you that HerbRally Schoolhouse, HerbRally's membership site, is now live. Each week we publish new exclusive content to our HerbRally Schoolhouse members. It costs only $10 a month, and we just continuously build on this membership area. To learn more, go to herbrally.com/schoolhouse. Okay, that's it from me for today. Thank you one more time to Jim McDonald. Check him out at herbcraft.org. Thanks to you all for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode, please give it a share. We'd really, really appreciate it. Okay, I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye.
Hey, it's Jim McDonald. Some days ago, as my daughter likes to say, the other day, and that means basically any day that's not today, Mason posted just a list of questions. He evidently had asked people, like, what would you want to ask an herbalist? And people asked things, and then Mason posted a list of their questions, and I looked at it and I thought to myself, like, hey, I don't have anything else I'm doing today. Really, probably I had things I needed to do and that I was totally behind on, but I blew them off and I went through the list and I answered all the questions. And I sent that to Mason. He's like, oh, this is really cool. Do you mind if I post this? And I'm like, that's why I did it. And then he said like, oh, maybe we can do like a podcast and have it like on audio. And I said, well, I've got a recorder. I'm recording on it right now. I could do that. I can just record the answers. Now, I will say that like, I'm probably not just going to read word for word the answers that I wrote. And I might even, and probably will, maybe alter or change or go in a different direction with different answers. So what I'm saying here now is not exactly what I wrote in the written version of this. But let's look at the questions. The first one was, what is the first plant you remember having a relationship with as a kid? And, you know, I don't have like the kid I was always into plants so much origin story that a lot of herbalists do. I know it's so disappointing. I should maybe make one up, but whatever. I grew up in a subdivision in the suburbs outside of Detroit, and like way outside of Detroit, not really near Detroit at all. It was very like 1980s Ronald Reagan subdivision world, you know. Houses, lawns, people had pools, some people had fences. And, you know, landscaping and mowed grass, and there were certainly weeds and everything, but I didn't have a very plant-focused life, but I did, you know, we played outside. That's what you did in the 80s. You just like left for the day and were gone and just outside. So we did a lot of stuff. We would go and play, and like the patch of woods in the neighborhood was called the woods. And the field that was a couple lots down from our house was the field. And we played in the woods and the field all the time. So I was definitely around plants and trees and nature, but not really super connected to it. But that said, if I have to think about a specific plant experience of my childhood, I do remember my mom said to me one probably summer, she said, there's a yucca plant growing in the backyard. I want you to dig it up. It's getting big and unruly. I don't want it there anymore. So please dig it up. And I got this little hand trowel and pulled all the lava rocks away, because again, it was the 80s. Black lava rocks were like pretty in thing for around your plants and your landscaping. Pulled those away and like dug, you know, big hole, deep taproot. And thought I got it all out. Filled up the hole, smoothed the lava rocks back out. And the next year, just a big old yucca plant, like I never even touched it. So that was a memorable childhood plant experience. Maybe not quite a relationship, but there you go. Okay, question. If you could have only 5 herbs growing in your backyard, what would they be? So the first answer to this is that these are impossible questions. None of us can answer that. But how about this? What if I say plantain, echinacea, violet, Solomon seal, mullein, and kava? Yeah, kava's not going to grow in my backyard, but I'm going to use magical thinking here. Yeah, that was 6 plants, but again, it's an impossible question, so that's what you get. Okay. Question. What can I do to support you for once? Now, I'm going to interpret this question, which isn't directed at me, was asked generally, but I'm going to interpret this question as saying, like, there's an herbalist whose work, you know, I've found to be really, really helpful, and in some way I'd like to be able to support them. And first of all, that's so kind. Thank you for that. Here's some ideas. One would be take a class, purchase some of the stuff we make. This really helps, you know, cover our bills and feed our families and pay our rent, and, you know, maybe gives us some splurge money to spend on probably bottles and mason jars and solvents and oil and beeswax, you know, all that kind of stuff. But that really helps. That's one amazing thing you can do to support us. Another thing that doesn't involve any currency is just sharing or speaking well of an herbalist, their work, their classes, their books, their offerings, their online courses, you know, events they're going to be at, anything that they do. If you can like share in person to people you know, and online and groups and forums and social media, whatever you use, that really helps to spread the word about what we do, especially since a lot of us don't really love advertising, and nothing we could say about ourselves is as cool as someone saying like, hey, this person's work and or this person's bitters or this person's classes or this person's consultations are really, really awesome and you should check it out. We can't say anything about ourselves that is good as someone else saying something nice about us. Another thing is, like, if you can and as you were able, let's say you ask an herbalist something, you email them, you talk to them after class, you send them a message on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and you feel that they really go the extra mile in responding to you and offering their time and energy and all that. Maybe think about offering some kind of like donation or tip or who knows what. Is just a gesture of like, thanks, I appreciate that. I don't think that most of us, we don't really want to have to, even though a lot of us do this for a living, I don't think most of us really enjoy like monetizing information. I know, at least for my part, and so many people I know, like, if we didn't live in a capitalistic society and we could just like share freely and turn people onto herbs and offer information and help people without there being a financial element to it, we would totally do that. But there is a financial element. And, especially if you really go the extra mile and you spend a lot of time, answering something for someone or figuring something out for someone or providing them with, like a lot of resources, not like just a link, like, here's an article, but a lot of resources. One of the things that we're not doing when we're doing that is something that generates income. And if so, every once in a while, again, as people are able to, they can offer some kind of tip or something like that. That's pretty awesome. I guess it doesn't even need to be, it doesn't even need to be like money or cash. That doesn't hurt though. I know that like one of the things that I've been gifted with, which has been really awesome, is like soap from like cool soap makers. They give me nice soap and like, that's really great. I think about it all the time, Okay. It makes me more happy and less smelly to get good soap. But there could be other things. Chocolate's nice. Those are just some ideas. Ultimately, I guess a good question is like, is there something that's doable for me that feels good that would support this person and what they do? Just think like that. Okay, question. How do I find out what I can take while breastfeeding? This is a pretty challenging and highly nuanced topic, right? There are absolutely some very good resources for finding, that people have compiled that say, there are studies and information to back up and support the use of this plant or that plant or that plant in pregnancy and or breastfeeding. And sometimes they're even classed as like levels of relative safety. It's a class, A or 2 or, whatever. And definitely look at that information. But a lot of herbs, they haven't, and they really won't ever be studied for that. You just can't like give herbs to pregnant and lactating people all the time and see what happens, right? That's kind of like not generally what people are going to do. And studies are expensive and they cost money and people want return on their investment. So a bunch of the herbs we use are just never going to be looked at. Sometimes an herb might be on a list that says like, oh, this herb is unsafe, even though it might not be a problem. Maybe what it is that the herb has a constituent in it that in isolation is unsafe. And the whole herb is probably okay. If I had to think of like 2 examples of that, I might think of like wild cherry bark or black cherry bark or choke cherry bark cough syrup. I feel pretty good about that. I'm not saying that everyone should, but I personally feel pretty good about using that during pregnancy and consider it to be quite safe. But peach and cherry, you could think about peach leaf tea or tincture too. They both have cyanogenic glycosides in them, which break down into hydrogen cyanide, which is clearly dangerous. But the levels you would get in like a peach leaf tea or a peach leaf tincture or wild cherry syrup are negligible and not scary and not significant. And in my opinion, don't take my opinion as gospel, it's just mine, not really worth being concerned over, right? Even though you'll see that, it's scary and dangerous and it has this awful constituent in it. Sometimes, though, the constituent might be an issue. And I know that this is controversial, but I'm going to say for me, pyrrolizidine alkaloids and something like comfrey, I'm not going to suggest that to someone who's pregnant or nursing. I don't feel comfortable with that. There is some evidence that shows problems with actual plants containing pyrrolizidine alkaloids used in pregnancy or while breastfeeding, and there's probably safer options. I know that, again, this is controversial. I know that some people will say like, oh, that's all overblown and it's really not a problem at all. That's not what my take on it is. I don't think that no one should ever use plants with pyrrolizidine alkaloids, but long-term or ongoing use in quantity doesn't feel like a great idea to me. And pregnancy and lactation, there's other stuff you can use that will be effective, that doesn't have the potential risk that pyrrolizidine alkaloid or PA containing plants would have. We also need to think about, what dose is a plant being used at? How long are we going to take it? Is it a part of a formula or not? If it's a part of a formula, is it a big part of a formula or a little pinch of a formula? Those are all considerations we would have. Generally, both in pregnancy and lactation, I would say that what we want to focus on is the gentlest and most food-like herbs with a history of use. And then if we're going to think outside of that, we want to look into things and try to find citations. But I know that everyone wants a chart. Everyone wants something that says this herb is safe, that herb is not safe, this herb is safe, that herb is not safe. And there's just really no way that a chart like that can have all the nuance that needs to be considered in order to answer that question. So yeah, complicated question. One last thing. If you're looking at information you might find online, you might find in a book, try to reason whether the person who compiled the information has any knowledge or experience using herbs. Some people are just compilers of information and they don't know what it is that they're compiling. They have no experience with it, right? For example, I could compile information on how to fix your brakes. But you know what I've never done? I've never fixed brakes. And so even though I can compile information, I probably am not a good person to learn how to fix brakes from. And people who compile information about herbs and natural products that have no experience with them might also not be a good source of information. One example of this, there's a very popular website, and it has a little page on herbs that decrease milk supply. And it gives a list of herbs, and it lists stinging nettles as a plant that decreases milk supply. And then in parentheses, right after stinging nettles, it says, not nettle, that increases milk supply. What? That's the same plant. So the person who wrote this doesn't know that they just said two different things about the same plant because they don't know. So I think if you want to learn about herbs, you should learn about herbs from people who use and understand herbs. At least they should be major sources of information when you're considering things. Question. What is your favorite resource for learning? Oh my God, there's so many. I want to say first and foremost, I rely a lot upon other herbalists' experience using plants. And there is a certain level of privilege here. I know a lot of other herbalists. And so one of the things that I can do is I can like email someone or message someone or call someone and be like, and a specific someone like, I'm wondering about this plant or about using a plant to address this issue. Where should I go? Oh, so-and-so I think uses this plant, or so-and-so is really good at addressing this particular condition. And then I can like contact them and ask them. I totally get that not everyone can do that. To a certain degree, maybe, you can ask people on forums online or on their social media pages, and they'll respond as they're able to. But that's probably the biggest thing that I do. I'm an herbalist. I work in the Western herbal model, and I'm strongly influenced by a lot of European folk medicine and Greek medicine, but especially in American herbalism, the eclectic and physiomedical traditions, and Henriette Kress's website, henriettes-herb.com, is so spectacular. It's just filled with so many books and resources of that era, and I am forever and always going there and cross-referencing uses of herbs on that website. I also really love, and it's been in the middle of, it's still the endless pandemic, I like herb conferences. And, you go there and you get to meet other herbalists, which is a good way to network and be able to ask specific specific questions. But also, there's a lot of learning and moments that happen in all the interstitial spaces. So between the classes, during lunch, Friday night, Saturday night, where, you can just be in a conversation that's happening among different people. And, it's not necessarily even part of what anyone is there to teach. It's just being in on the conversations in the general milieu of the herb conference is really pretty wonderful. I would also suggest, in terms of resources, always to try to remember to make sure you balance your thinky information learning with experiential learning. You taste and smell and touch and engage directly with plants, so that all of your learning isn't head learning. And then another thing that I just had to tack in here, it's not so much a resource, but always remain open to revision. So I know that so much of the way that we're taught to learn is there's a right thing, and we want to learn the right thing. We want to learn the right thing about how echinacea works on the immune system. We want to learn the right way to make tinctures. We want to learn the right way to address a thyroid imbalance. But sometimes when we have that goal of I want to know the right thing and then I know it, we don't stay as open to revision and to learning and to, saying oh, wait, this works for this situation, but maybe not that situation. Or, as is bound to happen to anyone, wow, I learned this and I thought it was right, but it turns out it's actually not right. So I need to learn and think something new. And that's easier to do if you have open-endedness built into your learning, so that you don't have to feel like you're giving something up, or that oh, wait, because I learned something new that contradicts with what I knew before, I was wrong and that was bad. The good and bad and right and wrong doesn't need to be into that. We just need to keep learning and keep remaining open. Okay. What difference and or similarities do you believe herbalism has in the present day compared to 50, 100, or even 200 years ago? Huge question. There's a lot of different ways we could think about this. In the context of Western herbalism, if I'm going to go back, and I'm only going to sort of partially answer this question. If I go back and I look at the eclectics and the physiomedicalists, and I look at their entries on plants, they knew a lot more about a lot of plants than we know now. It's not uncommon to look at an entry on golden seal and see that it had cardiac uses. And to my knowledge, I don't really hear people talking about golden seal for cardiac uses anymore. So there's a bunch of information that, we've lost. And I want to clarify too, like I'm talking about the eclectics, I'm talking about information that's written down. There's also a lot of oral tradition information from various cultures across the globe that we don't have, we don't understand in the same way anymore. And so in some ways you can look at like the herbalism of today and, you know, there's a bunch of stuff that's gone. There's a bunch of stuff that people don't know anymore or don't quite understand anymore. And maybe even the context has changed because people now are, you know, they're kind of the same as we've always been, but things are also different. You know, our lifestyles are different, and that impacts health so much. But also I could go back and I could think about the eclectics and the physiomedicalists who I have learned so much from and say like, wow, there's just a bunch of, I mean, like almost entirely, especially with written information, almost entirely all white men. And, you know, so like now I'm seeing more representation of different cultures and different traditions of herbalism and the way that they interact. And different types of people, right? Types of people related to culture, related to tradition, related to gender, related to all kinds of different things. And that is so much better because the more diversity we have in the presentation of the information, the more rich the herbalism we have now can become. And I want to say too, like, I really like a highly individualized kind of herbalism. You know, there are traditions and there are certainly people who prefer like, you know, like, oh, a codified system where everything is like, there's this and this herb is like this and that herb is like that. But I think that so much of herbalism hinges on the relationships we have with the plant we use, and everybody's relationship is different, both individually as individual people, but also culturally, you know. And the more that we can have representation of cultures without having to sort of like turn them all into a uniform mush of an everything kind of herbalism where everything is deprived of its origins, I think that can enrich us all. And so as that is happening and hopefully continues to happen and happens even more, I think that will bring out aspects of the tradition of herbalism that will be as rich as it has been in the past. Or at least that is my hope. Question. In what ways has herbalism changed your life, big and small? The degree to which my love of plants and nature and ecosystems and habitats, alongside with like the love I have for my family and friends, it's the foundation of my life, right? So that's a pretty gigantic thing. Herbs are like interwoven into everything that I do and I am. And I've used herbs for like really serious major health crises. And I've also like used herbs where like I'm just eating, you know, berries on the side of the trail, which is still using herbs, and feeling a connection of myself and the land that I live on. So it's just, you know, it's everything. And I hope, to be an herbalist in a way that is of service to the land that I live on. And that is both really big in terms of like that overall intention, but the bigness is made up of all kinds of small, precious moments, many of which just seem really simple, but they, you know, mean the world to me. So that's my answer for that. What was my most profound journey with a plant? So pretty early into when I first started getting into herbs, I was in college at the time, I became interested in Calamus root. And although I had read some stuff about Calamus root as being a bitter and a carminative, words that I did not understand at the time the way that I understand now, I had bought some Calamus root, and I would just take some of the cut and sifted pieces and munch on. It would nibble on them. I would chew on them. I would hold them on my cheek and sit there. And I started to be like, oh, wait, I'm starting to notice changes. Like I was feeling a certain way, and then I chewed on Calamus and something changed. And what was that thing that changed? Oh, that was the virtues of the influence of the Calamus on me where I was at. And the thing that was so profound about that is that it showed me that I could learn about and develop understanding of a plant by tasting it, by chewing on it, by using it, by being in direct relationship. And things didn't have to all be like, learn what constituents it has and what its actions are and all the other things. That the experience of plants taught very valuable things, and some things that I've really never read in books. So that happening very early in my study of herbs helped to influence the way that I learned from and engage with herbs from then on up until now, and hopefully forever into the future. How do you work with the business side of herbalism? So the answer to that is probably like either not so great or really not so bad. Me personally, I don't enjoy thinking about money. I don't enjoy thinking about my herbalism as a business. Like I think about it as a calling, and I think about it as a passion, and I think about it as something that I really enjoy, that's really, really fun. And it can be hard for me, because this is the way that I make my living, to be like, oh, in order for me to do this, I have to think about marketing and advertising and keeping receipts, right? And like, oh, I have to order bottles again, and all of those kind of like practical things. And I need to get labels and make the labels, and labels have to look a certain way. That's just, I got to fix my website. My website's so old, it doesn't work on phones very well. I have a new one that does. But those are all things that I don't think that I'm necessarily the greatest at. And if I could be better at that, I would generate more money, and I could both use that for really practical things, like helping to support my family. That's a very practical thing. But I could also use it for very hedonistic things. Like there's this incredible Kevlar solo canoe that only weighs 16 pounds, and I really would love to have it, but I totally can't afford it. Maybe if I was better at business, I would have like a ton of extra money, and I could just buy that and not feel like I was being irresponsible. That's not really the case right now. But again, maybe I'm not so bad at it, because I've been supporting my family as an herbalist for years. There was a time that I had another job, and I think it's important to say that, because I think a lot of times herbalists who are trying to make their herbalism their business or their profession or their livelihood can feel really frustrated and maybe even inadequate, because they feel like they should just be able to do herbalism and make a living. I had another job for a long time, and then I work more herbalism, and then eventually more herbalism and less other job, and then just herbalism and not the other job, until I've been doing just herbalism for quite some time. And I've been doing that, and I can't feed my family. And my home is, I need new carpet, but it's nice. I have a nice piece of land that we live on. So I'm not doing that bad. I shouldn't complain too much. It's still very much something that I am working on and trying to develop, and probably could get better at. Okay. Funniest and most memorable herb moment or experience. These are some of my best teaching moments. So, I was out in Boulder, Colorado, teaching about humoral temperaments with Rebecca Altman. And we have this funny joke about the word squirt. And in the middle of the second day of class, in the morning, I just reached down underneath the table and I pulled out a 2-liter bottle of squirt soda and just opened it. It made that sound. And then I started drinking it out of the bottle. It's kind of gross. I don't recommend that. And Rebecca was like, what? And then she looked and she saw, because I aimed the label at her so she could see. And then she just started laughing really hard. And it took a little while for her to catch her breath. That was funny. And that was fun. That was super memorable. I love that. She did something like a couple years later. I was teaching at a conference and she got people to just keep dropping off squirt cans at my vending table and in my classes like through the whole weekend. And she thinks that her joke was better. I think my joke was better. It's okay. We can both be right. Let's see. Another thing I could think that was really super fun is I was teaching at the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism. And Larkin Bunce, one of the founders and co-directors there, walked up to the table that I was teaching, that I had next to me, and she just put a bunch of random objects on the table. And I was like, what's this for? And she's just, knowing that I like to use props in teaching, she said, I just want to see what you're going to do with them. That was pretty fun. So those are things that stand out. Question: how do you find a healthy balance in your life? Do I always find a healthy balance in my life? I think it's more of like an ebb and flow of being in balance and then maybe not so much being in balance and then trying to get into better balance, rather than just like being in a state of balance. I think that just almost everyone I know who works in the health field, or in any kind of like holistic modality, knows that we are teaching and sharing and suggesting all kinds of things to people that make the most sense to us. And they're also things that we're probably also needing to apply to us and struggling with, as well. So, we say like, think about, not working so much, and then we work like crazy. Or we think, make sure you get out and can spend this much time in nature, and then we're busy and maybe not doing that. And so trying to be disciplined and make sure that we do the things that just like, we don't need studies to know that, resting more and sleeping better and getting more time outside is good for us. It just makes common sense that it's good for us. But it's not always good to do. So, working on trying to be kind of on the ball with that, and also trying to have sort of like compassion, with this, if we're not. So what we don't want to do is be like, oh my gosh, I'm such a fraud. Like, I tell people to do this, and then like, oh, I haven't been doing it. I tell everyone to take their magnesium every day, and I like haven't taken it in like 2.5 weeks because I was sick of the size of the giant magnesium pills, or, the taste of the fizzy magnesium powder or whatever. We don't want to be down on ourselves. We just want to like kind of say like, I know that this is important. I haven't been doing it. I need to get back on track with it. Maybe, shift up the form or, practice that we're doing. If maybe we were doing something that wasn't long-term sustainable, we can change it around a little bit and try to do that. I also think when we think about like, how do you find a healthy balance in your life? We just have to factor that there's stuff that we can do that we maybe call like, self-care and hopefully like self-celebration. But there's also, we live in dysfunctional societal structures that are working against us. I know that not everyone feels this way, but I do, so I'm going to say it. But like, we're all living in like a capitalistic society that thinks that our value is to be cogs in the wheels of capitalism and not just to be people enjoying the experience of being alive on a beautiful planet. So we can do a bunch of things, but if someone is sort of like struggling with, that healthy balance and, thinking like, oh, I need to do this and I need to do this and I need to do this. Another way that we can have compassion is to say like, oh, I realize that I'm like, surrounded by structures and systems that make it hard for me to be as balanced as I could be, were they not working against me. Question. What's your best piece of advice for running a clinical practice? So this probably isn't like the greatest question for me. I do work with people. I do it part-time. I've always done it like part-time mixed up with wildcrafting and writing and teaching and making medicines and studying about herbs all the time. It's been one of the things I do, but it's not the main thing that I do. And definitely there are more organized and structured people that could answer that question better than I could. Question. Which is your least favorite herb and why? So I don't dislike it as a plant, but if I never have to smell or, taste cilantro ever again, I will be fulfilled in life. Question. How did you become an herbalist? So I start everything with so. So it probably really, the honest thing is it's sort of like happened around me. I never made, I guess until much later after the fact, like a conscious decision, like, oh, I think I'm going to be an herbalist. I got interested in herbs and then I kept learning more about herbs and making more stuff. And after a few years, I sort of got nudged into teaching classes, like I kind of got, like teach classes. And I didn't know anything about it or how to do it or whether I'd be good at it. And I started doing it and I was like, well, that was fun. And, my house filled up with bottles and jars of herbs and lots of oil and alcohol and the counters and the closets and all the hallways and under the bed. And there's all kinds of preparations. And at one point, I remember the first time that I went down to the United Plant Savers Botanical Sanctuary in Rutland, Ohio. I got there and someone said, "Are you an herbalist?" And it didn't make any sense to say no. And so I said yes. And I guess that's when I became an herbalist. That's at least the day that I said so. I kind of think that the plants decided that whole issue for me rather than I did. Question. What is your COVID protocol? Okay, this is another very complicated one. I'm a Western herbalist, and the way that I use herbs is everything is rooted in energetics. So I don't have herbs for coughs and herbs for fevers and herbs for influenza. What I do is say, like, what kind of cough does a person have? What kind of fever do they have? How is influenza, or in this case, COVID, presenting for them? And then that will guide what types of herbs that I use for that person. My experience so far with COVID has been that, like, a whole bunch of people have had COVID and they've had it in different ways. Some had more respiratory system symptoms. Some had more digestive symptoms. Some people had higher fever. Some people had lower fever. Some people didn't have fevers at all. And so having a protocol for COVID might not make sense, because if someone, doesn't have a fever going on, we don't need to use herbs to support fever. If they have a high fever versus a low fever, we would use different herbs for the high fever than we would for the low fever. If they don't have a cough going on, we don't need an expectorant, right? So everything really depends on the presentation. I will say that there are some commonalities, and a lot of these are nutritional. So for pretty much everyone, I would suggest vitamin D3. I would suggest vitamin C. I would suggest zinc. Most people I've suggested echinacea to. Elderberry, I think, can apply to a lot of people because it's a sort of generalist herb. If someone has respiratory symptoms, I've very, very commonly say that steam inhalations with aromatic plants are really good. But outside of that, I'm looking for patterns of dryness, patterns of dampness. Do I need to relax tension? And that's all very personalized and very individual. I think that when we have a protocol for a condition, that's okay, but it has to be like a highly adaptable protocol for a condition so that we can apply it to the person who has the condition. Otherwise, even though we're still using herbs, it's not really holistic, right? If you have like anyone who has COVID gets this protocol, or anyone who has influenza gets this protocol, or anyone who has Lyme or who has lupus or who has whatever, gets this specific protocol and they get all of this stuff, then you're not treating the person. You're not really working holistically, even though you're using herbs. Everybody in holistic medicine says we treat the person and not the patient. Oh, wait, I didn't say that right. I'm going to start over. Maybe this could get edited. Maybe I'll go back and edit it, but maybe I'll just leave it in here because it'll take time to find it to edit. Everyone in holistic medicine says we treat the person and not the name of their condition. But if you have a static protocol for a condition that you give to everyone, you're not really doing that. So I think energetics is the part of herbalism that focuses on the person and not the name of the thing that they have. Hydration, totally important. How long did you study plant medicine before feeling qualified to call yourself an herbalist? So I kind of covered this just, a few questions ago. And I probably definitely called myself an herbalist before some people think that I should have or had any right to call myself an herbalist. But I also feel like I want more people to call themselves an herbalist. Like, I don't feel like it's something that we should be gatekeeping. There's a plane flying overhead, if you can hear that. I don't think that we should be kind of gatekeeping over the term. And I know that sometimes people who are clinical herbalists will say like, there's these people who are herbalists, they're beginner herbalists, and they shouldn't be calling themselves an herbalist yet because they don't know this or they don't know that. And, there's a case to be made for that. But there's also a case to be made for saying, if you use and love and grow or wildcraft or even purchase plants and you make stuff out of them and you give them to people to help them, like, what would you call yourself if not an herbalist? Saying that you are an herbalist doesn't mean you're an incredible herbalist. Or you're a clinical herbalist. It just means that you love and use plants to help yourself and other people. And I'm all about more people calling themselves herbalist. It's important to know your limitations. So if you're, for example, a beginning or a learning herbalist, you're still an herbalist, but you're probably not maybe the right person to treat someone with a very serious, very complicated illness. That doesn't make you not an herbalist. We just need to be herbalists who know what we're, able to handle and address and what we're not able to handle and address. And anyway, I don't have any kind of formal training either. So even now, you could make a case that, I'm not a trained herbalist. Okay, another question. How has herbalism enriched your life? Probably addressed this one under the question a little while ago. In what ways has herbalism changed your life, big and small? Next question. What was your most profound experience with a plant? So again, earlier I talked about, chewing on Calamus instead of like feeling it in my body and learning stuff. I still think about that as being like a profound experience with a plant. And the question is, what was your most profound experience with a plant? But there's probably not one most. Like, there can be like a whole bunch of different most. It's kind of like, what's your most favorite child? And, like all of them in different ways. So I'm going to use that kind of logic and pick another thing. So I told a story earlier, the first question about when I was a kid digging up the yucca root. And ironically, and I've only ever thought of this as I was answering these questions, the first plant that I wildcrafted intentionally as medicine was burdock. And again, big, long, super deep taproot, which I dug up with a really too small hand trowel. And I, dug it up next to the barn by the house I lived in college, and I brought it in the house, and I washed the dirt off of it, and I chopped it up, and I put it in a pot of water, and I brought it to a boil and maybe simmered it for a little bit. And I waited until it was cool enough to drink, because I had read in my herb books that burdock was just really good for you and kind of good for everything. And I drank the cup of tea, and I sat down, and I waited for something to happen. And I think that everything that has happened with me ever since that first cup of intentionally wildcrafted tea is what happened from that first cup of wildcrafted tea. So that strikes me as pretty profound. Question. I feel like I rely a lot on my books and notebooks. How long did it take you before you could remember independently and project confidence with your herbs? Okay, another great question. Another thing where there's tons of nuance and tons of different ways to think about it. So I'm going to factor a few different approaches when I think about the answer to this question, both in terms of using herbs and teaching herbs. And to me, those things overlap because I always feel like if I'm teaching a class, that's me teaching herbalism to a group of people. And if I am doing a consultation with someone individually, it's really still more of me teaching them about like why I would suggest certain herbs than me just saying like, use this one or use that one or use whatever. So they're kind of similar or even kind of the same to me. And we all have different learning styles, different presentation styles, different strengths, different predispositions for how we're going to communicate what we know about plants. And we don't want to think about, and I know it's really easy to do this, we don't want to think about like, this person does it like that, and I think that that's so amazing and so profound, and so that's like what I should shoot for is my goal. As an example, I can just go on and on and on about plants for hours with no notes. I just kind of like start talking, say a bunch of stuff, and then, when I finish the rambling thought that I have, I just stop and think for, a second, and then I say some more stuff that I know, or someone asks a question, and I'm like, ooh, I wasn't going to go there, but let's see what happens when I open my mouth and expound about that. And I'm a rambler. I can do that, but not everybody does that. I know some people who can, they remember studies. And they can say like, oh, in this study, 46% of the blah, blah, blah using such and such did. I can't remember stuff like that at all. I don't remember numbers out loud, and that maybe someone could say like, oh, you don't remember the ranges for like test numbers of what would be normal or high or low. That's stuff that I always have to look up because for me, numbers don't stick in my head. I know people who know how to say out loud with all of the syllables the full words of what DHA and EPA stand for. I could never do that. And I know people who, when they teach, they've got notes or they've got PowerPoints or they're following an outline, and none of these different teaching or interaction styles or consulting styles is better than another one. They're just different kinds of styles. It's sort of like if we were to think about music, and be like, oh my gosh, I really love the way this person plays guitar or the way that this person sings, and we want to be able to do that, but maybe that's not the way that we play guitar or sing or drum or whatever. And what we want to do is find what our strengths are and figure out how to do that. And so if you need to rely on your books and notebooks, and that helps you out because you can like reference stuff rather than just saying stuff and not being totally sure that it's right all the time. I'll admit to that. I think most of it is. That's just totally fine. Like, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a bunch of things that in my head I just know, and I can say. And then there's a bunch of things that even if I learn them every single year, I have to look them up every time I think about them. And that's totally normal. There's plants that I might be doing a walk and someone says, "What's that plant?" And I look at it, and it's not that I don't know what the plant is. I might be like, "That's the plant that grows by my hose spigot in my backyard. I totally know what that plant is." But every year I forget the name of that plant and I have to look it up, and I'm like, "Oh, it's that plant." So like sometimes we know stuff, but we just don't know it off the top of our head. Notes are good for that. Why might people have to keep looking stuff up, though? There might be more to answer this question. I think that some people, it's hard to keep stuff in their head because they're learning so much stuff all at once. And that would be hard for me. I've learned about herbs and about using herbs for people, and I guess ferrets sometimes too, slowly and organically over a really long time. And I know that there's a lot of people who I love and respect and think super highly of that, offer these 2 or 3 year clinical herbalism programs or apprenticeships, and people go through them and they learn and they retain a ton of information and they get out of it and they're like solid. And for me, I think that would actually be hard. I don't think like my skill set is learning a bunch of information all at once like that and holding on to it and putting it together. Like I learn something and I go off and I explore it. And then when I feel like I've got that solid, I move on to the next thing. And everything's really been kind of on my schedule. And again, that's been over the course of decades. And there's still areas that I have holes in my knowledge of, or that I don't know really well. But that's okay, because there's nothing wrong with me, in a consult or in a class saying like, I don't know, I'd need to look that up. Cool thing about like the internet, phones or laptops is you can be like, I don't know, let's look that up. And also like, I don't know the answer to that, but that would be a great question for so-and-so. So there is my answer to remembering things independently. Oh, projecting confidence by doing it over and over and over and over again. And you will have times where you do something, even after you think you're good at it, and like in a given situation, it's like, oh wow, that totally didn't work. I did not pull that off. Everybody has those experiences. That's normal. Question: what herb introduced you to the healing world of plants and why? Burdock. I mentioned the story of gathering that burdock for the first time, and that would being like the herb that I harvested intentionally as an herb, as a medicinal plant for the first time. Why was that the one? Because it was easy to recognize. It was growing next to my barn, and at the time I was in college at Michigan State University, I would pass by the Beale Botanical Gardens, and I was walking through them, and I saw the plant that grew next to the barn, and I walked up to it, and there was a little sign at the bottom that said burdock, and then I went home and looked it up in my book, and that's how that became the first one. Question: why isn't the importance of herbal energetics stressed more in each and every video posted on any particular herb? More often, I suppose. People watch videos on YouTube and think they're qualified to recommend herbs right away. What about the energetics of herbs? I am totally with you. I think it's really important, and it's the foundation of everything that I do. But, some people, that's not their thing, And I guess that's okay, but I always want to look, even if I find a good resource and someone says something profound about an herb that I've never heard before. Let's think of an example. This, by the way, is not in the written version. Let's say I'm thinking about barberry or Oregon grape or golden seal or coptis or argarita or some other berberine-containing plants. And then I read that, the constituent, berberine, seems to act as a PCSK9 inhibitor. PCSK9 is, of course, everyone's favorite Star Wars droid. No, it's actually PCSK9 inhibitors work in the liver to enhance and improve the rate that your body clears cholesterol out of the body. So, right, it enhances and improves cholesterol clearance in the body. There are certain kinds of drugs called PCSK9 inhibitors that are used as cholesterol-lowering medications is an alternative mode of action to the way that statins work, which is by, like, impairing the production of cholesterol. So I can, like, read something and be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It is about berberine, the constituent, and not about plants that have berberine in it, but still pretty interesting anyway. And, you know, berberine is a bitter compound, and bitters do, as a whole, you know, as a general principle, improve lipid clearance from the body by their action on stimulating bile release. So that's pretty interesting. But then if I was thinking like, oh, someone has high cholesterol, and I learned this about berberine, and it correlates with an herb being bitter, then I would also think like, and bitter herbs are cooling and drying. And if I was going to try this out with someone, is cooling and drying appropriate for them? And then if it maybe isn't, maybe someone has a colder, drier constitution, I would think like, oh, that doesn't necessarily mean that I can't use it, but it does mean that I would need to maybe add some more warming and aromatic herbs and think about adding demulcents if they're more dry. And so even when I learn something that is outside of the energetic realm or an energetic presentation of a plant or a constituent in a plant, I can still like backfill in the energetics myself. So just because someone doesn't convey energetics doesn't mean that we can't go and seek out energetics and backfill that information. What is the most vital, often used herb in your first aid kit? It's another one of these, like, the most vital, the most often used. I'm not gonna pick one. I can't pick one. I'm gonna say 3. Plantain, which can be used as poultices and tinctures and salves and soaks. And thinking about it is healing injuries to the skin and mucosa, even bites and stings and stuff like that. Echinacea as a tincture, strong infusion or decoction or a soak. Echinacea soaks are amazing. So really wonderful for all manner of infections. And then I just have to also say propolis tincture is just an amazing sort of like liquid bandage, wound dressing, protective coating that stimulates healing of the tissues that you apply it to. So it's protective, it fights infections. Will add on, because this is important, propolis is a resin. We generally extract it at as high proof alcohol as we can get a hold of, which means that it'll sting and burn going on. So if you have like, and I've done this with myself, you have like a 2nd degree scald and you're like, I'm going to put some propolis tincture on that. It's going to be excruciating. Like, maybe do that to yourself, but, that's not a good idea to do to other people. Unless they're an herbalist and you're like, this is going to hurt so bad, but I think it's a good idea. And they're like, I get it. You can do it. I love treating herbalists. They'll let you do so much stuff. What northeastern herb is comparable or comparable, if you say it that way, to or equal to osha root? Of course, nothing is really equal to any other thing. And if I had to think about like, oh, you don't have osha root, but you really want to use something that's pretty darn close to osha root, what's it going to be? Not a wild plant, but lovage root, which can be grown in the Northeast, I think covers a lot of the ground and has very similar overlapping virtues to osha, more than a lot of other herbs that I could think of. If we were thinking about this is not the question, but up in the Pacific Northwest, I know that people use Oshala. I don't know how to say that. I've seen it written down, but it's Ligusticum grayi, I believe. And people call that like little osha or something like that and use it for similar indications. That's just for people who live on the other side of the north part of the country. Except that people on the other side of the north part of the country are like, hey, that's Alaska. I don't know if it grows in Alaska. I mostly know about it growing in the Pacific Northwest. Question. What is the one thing you do daily to practice your craft? I'm pretty into the Greek concept of humoral temperaments. And they're, kind of like the Greek or Western version. Actually, how should we say? We maybe shouldn't even say weak. It might be a good... so I said weak. We probably shouldn't necessarily only say Greek. We might do better saying Mediterranean, which would include like Egypt and the Middle East in the formation of this system of medicine. But there are the four temperaments: sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, and melancholic. Everyone is, of course, a mixture of all four, and they may express different temperamental inclinations in different situations and different contexts. I'm pretty sanguine. That's the air element. And sanguines are like unstructured, right? And so discipline is not super easy to me. But I will say I've been pretty disciplined about taking my herb formula for my heart since I almost died. That was a good motivator. So there's that. That's one thing that I do. But also just another thing is just like open-endedly thinking about plants and the way that they work, and about herbalism and about people and about actions and about energetics all the time. Like just every day being like, And open-endedly, I think, is like a key point, at least for me. It's not like I have to think about things with the goal of like, I'm going to figure this out, but just having wonder, which is both wondering and being in a state of wonder all the time about plants. I think that that's a good daily practice. If you only had room to plant 3 herbs, which would you choose and why? Also, impossible. I think I'm going to grant myself some leeway in this because it says plant 3 herbs, and I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to assume that I can use still all of the stuff that grows wild around here. And I'm going to pretend that one of the plants I could actually grow here in Michigan, which I can't, but I'm just going to pretend like I can. So 3 plants, milky oats, just awesome. Doesn't grow wild here, but I use it so much. And orange mint. Orange mint is my favorite mentha. I really personally just really connect with and love this one to a greater degree than I like peppermint or spearmint. So definitely orange mint. That doesn't grow wild around here. And I'm going to pretend like I can grow kava here because, like, if I could grow kava here, that would be wonderful. I would grow a bunch of different varieties of kava. Question. What herbs would be good for a child recently diagnosed with Hashimoto's, but not yet taking medication for it? Me personally, would totally call Thomas Easley, and I would say, hey, Thomas, what herbs would be good for a child recently diagnosed with Hashimoto's, but not yet taking medication for it? Because I don't really know that one well enough to come up with a great, suggestion or answer to that without talking to other people. And for me, he would be the person that I would probably call. Not because he's the greatest in the world about that, but maybe like he's the person that I know well enough that he would, he would answer the phone.
All right, just going to interrupt the show real quick to let you know that HerbRally is not just a podcast, but we also have tons of epic, lengthy, well-written plant or herbal monographs. And basically a monograph is just compiled information on one particular plant where they talk about ecology, botany, medicinal uses, sometimes stories, personal experiences, so on. So there's like a 22-page calendula monograph by Sage Popham. There's a really amazing oats one, Avena Sativa by Laura Pacheco. I really love the one on blue vervain by Geraldine Lavin. Blue vervain is one of my personal plant allies, so I really dig that one. But yeah, just find dozens of monographs at herbrally.com/monographs. One more time, that's herbrally.com/monographs. Okay, I will get out of your ear now. Back to the show. Enjoy.
What are the tells that indicate switching herbal remedies might be in order when treating a person? This is such a good question. I think that some people, they meet with someone, they assess what's going on with them, and they come up with a formula and, it would be like, okay, here, take this. But an important part of herbalism is that if your formula is working, if your formula is doing stuff, they're hopefully going to improve or change, and that formula might need to be reevaluated or tweaked in different ways to address, oh, that's gotten better, I don't need to keep doing that. Oh, that new thing came up, maybe I need to think about that. Oh, that's sort of resolved, and because that's not the major complaint anymore, it shows something that was a minor complaint that was there the whole time but just wasn't at top of mind when we were thinking about what we were going to address. So there's a whole bunch of shifting that happens when people take stuff, and as they shift, that's a good idea to sort of reevaluate, do I need to keep using all of the stuff in this formula, or do I need to tweak it, take some things out, add more of other things, whatever. So maybe one answer is the formula working as you expect it would or should? Has anything changed? Are there any signs that the person is getting worse as opposed to getting better? To me, that's an indication that, maybe my initial strategy wasn't going in the right direction. That happens all the time. We as herbalists do not get it right the first time we see or talk to someone or present an idea. And just because we might have gotten it wrong doesn't mean oh crap, I got it wrong, because sometimes the way that someone responds adversely or negatively or is aggravated by something we suggest gives us a new piece of information that we can be like, oh, I thought it was this, and I did this for it, and that made sense. But when they responded like that, that makes me think I got that idea confused with this idea, and now I need to go in another direction with it. So it's not like a failure when we get something wrong. It's an opportunity to reevaluate. So that makes sense. And then another thing would be is the person sick of taking what you made for them? They're just done with it? And I think that happens sometimes, if you make someone a tea and you're like, oh, here, have this tea, drink this tea. Maybe it's a gut healing tea for a digestive issue. And they drink it for a while, and then, it's not that it tastes bad. They just get tired of it. They want something else. You can swap things out and change them, and change the herbs while keeping the actions that the tea has together. So same reasoning and rationale for the tea and what's in it, you just choose different herbs. Maybe you switch around your aromatic, or you switch around your astringent, and that changes sort of the feel and flavor of the tea and allows people to keep at it. Question. I keep hearing that local plants are the most potent. Is it possible / reasonable to find or grow everything you need for health in your locality? I don't think that local plants are inherently the most potent plants. I don't even believe that there are most potent plants. And I know that people that live in certain areas sometimes say that. I've heard people say oh, the rainforest is such an intense and dynamic ecosystem that rainforest plants are incredibly potent. Or desert plants, because they survive in the desert, which is such an intense environment, are especially potent. But I just don't believe that herbs from India are more potent than herbs for China, are more potent than herbs from Brazil, are more potent than herbs from Michigan, are more potent than herbs from California, are more potent than herbs from Norway. right? Herbs grow in their habitat, they grow in their environment, and they're suited to that. They're growing in the place that they're supposed to grow. And so they're just doing what they do. So I don't think we need to think about like herbs from a specific locality are more potent. But if we think about herbs from your locality, where you live, are more potent than herbs from somewhere else, well, one reason that might be is because they're fresher, right? So if I think about red clover that I've gathered here in Michigan versus red clover that maybe I got in the bulk herb trade that came from Eastern Europe, I don't necessarily think that my red clover is inherently more potent than the red clover from Eastern Europe, but I do think that like my red clover is probably a lot fresher. It was probably collected and dried and processed on a much smaller scale, and I'm using it I'm using it sooner after it was collected than something that I would get that had gone through like a commercial herb trade. You know, it's probably not like if it's an herb that's gathered in springtime, let's say cleavers, you gather cleavers in the springtime and you dry it, and then you're making teas with it or making medicine with it. Compared to buying cleavers that was grown in, Europe in the commercial herb trade, that's probably not from like that spring. So more time has gone by, and as more time goes by, and I think like when things are processed on a much larger scale, it's more likely that there can be, more degradation of a plant's constituents and potency, more potential for oxidation, more light or heat exposure, and so there's that. And then also, when I think back about like the way that herbalism traditionally existed, before modern commerce, yes, the dominantly the plants you would use would be plants that grow locally, and yet there has always been herbs as like the most valuable objects of trade. There's always been herbs as like, I'm going to go on this trading trip from this place to this faraway place. What am I going to take to trade? I'm going to take herbs. And so people would have used stuff like that. They would have always used stuff from other places. I remember reading that they did a hair analysis on Egyptian mummies to find out like what kind of things that they were using, and they were shocked because they found traces of cocaine and nicotine, which means that they somehow had access to tobacco and coca, and those are South American plants that don't grow in Africa or Asia or Europe at all, which means that there was transatlantic trade at the time of ancient Egypt. That wouldn't have been the majority of something that everybody used, but it always would have been a part of herbalism. So I feel pretty good about that, and maybe that's also how I justify like my love and adoration of kava. So I want to say also that this is how I feel good about using herbs, mostly stuff from where I live, and then some stuff from other places, for me, a much smaller percent of stuff that comes from other places. But if someone's into Chinese herbalism or Ayurvedic herbalism or whatever herbalism, and they feel good about, getting most of their herbs from some other place because it's part of the tradition that they're into, then that's awesome. Like, that totally is great. I would say that ensuring the ethics of harvesting and sustainability is still incredibly important, but there's no reason that someone like has to use stuff or that it's a failing if they don't use stuff that grows by them. Different herbalists, different approaches. Question: do dried herbs lose their potency over time? And if so, how long? Yes, dried herbs definitely lose their potency to varying degrees over time. Some herbs hold their potency for quite a long time. Other herbs lose their potency significantly, like kind of quickly. And you really have to assess the different plants and how they last individually. What I tend to do is, look at the herb and like, does it still look the green color that it was when I first had it dried out and everything. I crush up and smell the herb. If it's supposed to be an aromatic herb, is it still aromatic? Is the scent that it had when it was fresh or freshly dried still prominent? If it was astringent, can I still, if I taste it, feel that astringency? If it's bitter, supposed to be bitter, is it still taste bitter? If it's demulcent, does it still get slimy when you mix it with water? That's a lot of what I use. It would be considered organoleptic assessment, using your senses to assess herb potency. And if you think about like herbs that last longer and herbs that don't last as long, if you have dried basil, we know that like right when you dry basil, it's like really pretty incredible. And then like over time, it just loses some of its basally aromatics. And if you compare that to like dried oregano, I'm using this example because it just recently happened to me, is I ran out of oregano and I was making pizza sauce. And I was like, well, I really want oregano in my pizza sauce. So I went rummaging through the spice cupboard and like way in the back in an unlabeled bag, which is not a great thing, by the way. You should always label your bags of herbs. There was like some not very green looking herb, and I didn't know what it was, but I thought like, it looks kind of like dried oregano looks. And I grabbed a pinch and I crushed it up and it smelled like oregano, and I tasted it and it was like, tasted really like oregano. I have no idea. That dried bag of herb from a food co-op somewhere has to be like years and years and years and years and years and years old. And it still was, it had all of the oregano-iness that I wanted for my pizza sauce. Had it been basil that was that old, I don't think it would have been spectacular. So use your sentences, make that assessment. There's another thing that I started doing, is I used to go through my herbs my jars of herbs, dried herbs, every year or two, and basically be like, oh, this is from that time, and that's too old, and I'm going to get rid of it, or like, oh, this one's like 6 years old, I should get rid of that. And I don't do that anymore. What I do is I open this stuff up and I taste it and smell it, and if there is something that I'm like, yeah, this ground ivy sure has lost a lot of its aromatics. Ground ivy is a plant that doesn't hold its aromatics a terribly long time after you dry it. Rather than getting rid of it, I'll be like, I need to harvest more ground ivy. And I will get rid of the old ground ivy when I harvest new ground ivy, because there has been some occasions where I've thought to myself like, oh, I got rid of that ground ivy like 2.5 months ago, and now it's just like, it's really the thing that I wish that I had. And even though it wasn't like the greatest quality that I would have hoped for, I would rather have like had some to try out than having none to use. So I will get rid of stuff as I replace it, and I will taste and smell to figure out what I need to harvest to replace something. How do you know when the right time to supplement... Oh, sorry, I misread that. How do you know when it is the right time to supplement herbal remedies with modern Western medicine? And here, again, this entirely depends on individual circumstances, so it's a little bit hard to just give a general answer. But I do want to say that it's really common for people who have a holistic bent or a holistic ideology, or who really feel strongly about natural medicine, to maybe think that like, if they have to use conventional medicine, that natural medicine failed them, or they failed natural medicine, or, like that it reflects poorly on, natural medicine, that they have to use conventional medicine. And I don't think this is true, and I don't think it's helpful. And if we think about what the term holistic actually means, it means inclusive of all modalities and not just natural modalities. So I would really say it's important not to let idealism make taking care of yourselves or your friends or your family or your community harder than it needs to be, and not to give yourself a hard time if you're like, I'm trying, but I don't have a handle on this. And so they had to get antibiotics. And so like, I wish I could have done that with herbs, like, I mean, yeah, to a certain degree, like I would be happy if I could always treat stuff with herbs and never treat stuff with antibiotics. But if someone has like a recent tick bite that has a bullseye rash around it, or if they have a kidney infection, antibiotics are pretty awesome. And we don't need to look at that as like the fact that antibiotics are really indicated or that work great for a situation as reflecting negatively in any way on natural medicine. Holistic, whole, inclusive of all options. What has been the most important aspect and most important plant in your practice? The most important aspect might be something that I try to do, which is to wait until I can sit and talk with somebody about what's going on with them before I come to conclusions about what's going on with them. I just talked with someone yesterday, not yesterday for you, but yesterday for me. And I had gotten sort of like the Cliff Notes version of what had been going on for them. And like anyone, I think, I made like, there's this and there's that, and they eat like this and they do that, and they have this family history, or, could be this, could be that. And then after I talked to him, a bunch of the stuff that I had mused about just really didn't seem to fit. It's not bad that I mused about some ideas before I talk to them. That's actually a good thing. It's a way we can prepare. But we don't want to come to conclusions. We don't want to be like, oh, well, they eat this thing or they drink that thing, and so that's the cause for all of their problems, and it's decided, and, the thing I need to do is tell them not to do that anymore and that they have to do this. And then when you talk to them and maybe you see that reasoning, like, has some holes in it, feeling in any way attached to or defensive of it. So like being in the moment with people and, hearing them and letting their experience and presentation guide what you're going to suggest, and maybe not your ideology about like, oh, I came to this conclusion, or the way that I think about things tells me that it must be this. So that's an important aspect of my practice. Let's see. Another plant question. I've said a few different ones. Most important plant in my practice. I'm just going to say a different one. How about milky oats? Milky oats, the fresh, unripe seed of the oat plant, Avena sativa. I make a tincture out of it. You kind of like grow it or get it from people who grow it, and you can squeeze it, and this milky juice comes out. Earlier, it's a little bit watery. Later, it's a little bit pasty. Some mixture of those stages is good. And it's a spectacular nervine tonic or tropho-restorative. And it's really like, when I make nervine blends for people, because I think that stress, I was just talking about ideology. Here's my ideology. I think that stress is a huge factor in almost everything that's going on with almost everybody. I tend to make blends based on milky oats. So I think like, what can I mix with milky oats for this person? What can I mix with milky oats for that person? It's a really important herbs for me. Of course, it's not the best herb for everyone. Some people might react to the grain proteins that it has. It doesn't actually have gluten, but it does have grain proteins. There is no one plant that's good for absolutely everyone, but I sure do use that one a lot, and it's definitely very important in my practice. Question. What does being an herbalist mean to you and your life? There are a lot of people that I have learned really important things about plants and about herbalism and about health conditions from. But if I had to think, like, I should say, there's also a lot of people that I've learned about how to be an herbalist from. And any time that someone says, like, who are strong influences to you, or whose books do you recommend, or who's whatever. I always feel like a struggle, because there's the people who pop initially into my mind, and then I think, oh, but I'm leaving out this person, or I'm leaving out that person. And so I'm going to have to, unfortunately, leave out people here. But I'm going to mention 2 different people. When I think of Rosemary Gladstar and I think of Christopher Headley, I think that they both stand out as people that I've known, that I look at them and it's not just stuff they know about plants or stuff they know about the practice of herbalism, but really like how they carried themselves as herbalists, that really inspire me. And a big reason for this is that both of them were just incredibly kind and incredibly supportive to me when I was just a wee little herbalist learning things and sort of like coming up in the milieu of herbalism. Both of them, I think, looked at what I was doing and said like, oh, wow, this person is like, you know, they have some talent and they're very sincere and they're very passionate, and like, we will do little things that we can do to help and support them. And that really made such a strong difference to me. I mean, both of them gave me opportunities. Both of them said nice things about me to other people. Both of them, you know, like were there to offer insights and everything. And I should say both of them, there weren't people that, well, Christopher Headley wasn't. He passed away a few years ago, and Rosemary's still around. They're not people that I talk to on a regular basis. You know, I met Christopher in person once, but we would email back and forth occasionally. And Rosemary, I met her. She was one of like the first herbalists, established herbalists that I met. And she was just so great and so kind to me. It was like in the era the internet was around, but we used to write letters back and forth, which we still do sometimes. And she was just very encouraging and gave me some opportunities and said nice things about. She opened doors of possibility for me in a way that inspired me to do that for other people. So both of them, because of their kindness and their encouragement, inspire me to be a kind and encouraging herbalist for other herbalists, either ones who take my class or people who, you know, I just see doing things. Like it's kind of nice, and I'll do this, you know, occasionally to the degree that I'm able, is just like to reach out to somebody and be like, hey, I really like what you do. It's nice that's a good thing to be like that to people. An added note in this regard, I'm thinking about my words. If you have an herbal teacher or an herbal practitioner that doesn't appreciate you, that doesn't appreciate your support of them as a teacher or a practitioner, who isn't kind to you, I think you probably deserve better than that. You probably deserve more than that. I know that a lot of people think like, oh, this person was really like tough on me as a way to like make me work harder and like make me do stuff and make me figure out stuff on my own. And I guess there's something to that approach, but I feel really blessed that I was able to learn from people who were kind and supportive of me. And generally, I would suggest trying out that avenue when you're working with teachers or practitioners. Question: what are your favorite smoking herbs, and what is their intention? So if we're talking about smoking herbs, it makes sense to at least acknowledge that tobacco is an amazing and powerful plant. If you smoke tobacco regularly / habitually as an addiction or a compulsion, or in quantity, that is dangerous, and it is often self-abusive. And I think it's funny that in our culture sometimes we talk about tobacco abuse. even in the mainstream culture, we say like, oh, these people are abusing tobacco. And I'm like, I really like the phrasing of that, because I feel like that kind of use of tobacco is actually an abuse of the tobacco plant as a powerful and sacramental herb. But used intentionally, used with maybe some level of prayer, I think it can be powerful, and we shouldn't just like view tobacco as like, oh, it's cancer causing and it's a vice and, you know, it's a bad plant and don't use it, without recognizing what a powerful and sacred plant that it is. So there's that. One of the things I might also think about that I learned from an herbalist in Michigan named Joyce Wardwell. Joyce Wardwell is brilliant. She wrote the Herbal Home Remedy book, and she's just such an amazing and skilled practitioner. Is if you're making a smoking blend and you're thinking about like, what am I going to build this blend around? What's my base going to be? A lot of people often choose mullein leaf, and mullein leaf is wonderful. I adore mullein, but I learned from her about using corn silk as a base for smoking blends, and corn silk is pretty awesome. It's got a nice flavor. It holds everything together. And it's maybe a little bit less harsh than mullein can be. So there's that. And then something that I picked up ages and ages and ages ago from Howie Brownstein out in Eugene, Oregon, is that when you're making smoking blends, and people are thinking about like, oh, I want it to have good flavor. What am I going to use? Astringents give smokes body, and they like fill up the body of the smoke and add flavor in a way that is in a lot of ways more substantial than just combining a whole bunch of aromatic herbs together. Right? Aromatic herbs and smoking blends are great, but oftentimes people, I think, mix too many aromatic herbs together. It makes the smoke kind of heady and ungrounded, and astringent leaves and barks work great. Howie has a good article on smoking herbs on his website, and sometimes he does classes on it, which might be online. Learn about smoking herbs from Howie Brownstein. Question. How did you first start incorporating herbs into your daily life? Probably the first thing that I do, the thing that I'm still doing, is spending time in nature with actual plants that are growing in the ground. Preparation-wise, the first stuff that I started making were teas. As time went on, I started making more tinctures, I made syrups, I made oils, and I made salves. But I never stopped drinking teas. Teas are important. We're herbalists. We tell people to drink tea. That's just a huge part of herbalism. And every once in a while, I hear people ask questions like, are you more into using teas or more into using tinctures? And I don't think it's not an either or. It's not an either or question. You can use like both and. So think about that. Question. What do you think is the most effective way to start communicating with plants? I have a strong opinion here. When I hear people talk about communicating with plants, sometimes I think it's done in a manner that isn't really especially empowering, because it's presented like with a certain sort of like framework of this is like what communicating with plants is. So like if you're communicating with plants, you have a dream or a vision, and maybe I'm actually looking at this little sculpted green woman woodwife thing that's on the side of my house. She's got plants coming out of her hair and everything. A plant appears to you like a person, and it says something profound to you about your life or about plants or about nature or about reality in like English or whatever language you speak. And sure, that's powerful. But if I think about communicating with plants, I don't think that they're more profound if I visualize or see or experience them being like humans. I think the highest form of a plant is the plant. the plant that's there growing in the soil, in its ecosystem, and that plants communicate to us by the way that they grow and where they grow and how they grow and what they sound like when the wind blows and what they taste like and what they smell like and what kind of textures they have. To me, the language of plants is how they exist in this world, and not like in a visualized interpretation that is often human-centric. And again, like if you do that and that happens to you, that's totally cool. There's absolutely no denying that. But I think that it's important to remember that everyone is able to talk to, quote unquote, talk to and experience and communicate with plants. And it doesn't have to be in this sort of like visualized manner. Simplest question: how do you want to communicate with plants? Spend time with plants. Pay attention to how you feel and the impressions you get when you're around them. Question: how do you retain so much information regarding clinical herbalism, and how do you store it? I.e. notebooks, flags, and reference books, or just memory? For me, it's a combination of all of these things. And then I would add on like so many open tabs on like so many open browser windows that my computer is slower than it needs to be. The more that my knowledge about plants is experiential, and what I mean by that is tied to a case with myself or somebody else, so that there's sort of like a story around it and an actual occurrence of it happening, and not just like the ideological part of it, the easier it is for me to remember and to retain it and to hold it in my head. For me, I like to make up stories and make up analogies and think about using all kinds of props to keep concepts in my mind. But really, all of the above. I'm super crazy messy, and there's just piles of like notes and I guess piles of tabs on my computers and piles of books and piles of conversations in my mind. So that kind of messy organization. If you want something like structured, organized, yeah, I'm not the right person to answer that question. Question: what does healing mean to you? I think it means taking care of yourself and others wherever they're at. And I don't mean geographically, I mean wherever in the process that they're at. So healing is not a destination. It's how you're treating yourself or others, or encouraging others to treat themselves in the moment that they're in. That's where healing happens. It doesn't happen in the future. It doesn't happen in the past. If you want healing to happen, you need to be present in the moment and think like, are the choices and actions I'm taking right now leading me towards health and where I want to go? If so, that's healing. If not, there's going to be another moment, a second later, and a second later, and a second later, and a second later, and a second later that can lead towards healing. It really helps if judgment and idealism about what healing means are kept in check, so you can be in that moment and not thinking like, oh, but I should be doing this, or I didn't do that, in a way that, is less than empowering or makes you feel not good, Question: how do you know what the potency of your herbal concoctions are? Well, as I said earlier, when I was talking about testing the potency of like dried herbs and how much they last, for me, it is primarily by what they taste like, what they smell like, in the case of astringents or demulcents, what they like feel like on your tissues. And this is something that we call organoleptic assessment. It's just a fancy word for like qualitative assessment using your senses. There are some things that I can smell and taste for. I can smell for, the degree to which an aromatic herb has a preparation of aromatic herb has captured its aromatics. If I make, something out of lemon balm, and that intensely fresh lemony fragrance is like not really there so much. I know that I lost something. But there's other constituents that I can't really so easily taste for, right? Maybe polysaccharides, I can't be like, taste it and be like, ooh, I can tell this is like loaded with polysaccharides. Sometimes you can see some things like I guess the inulin in echinacea. You make an echinacea tincture or a burdock tincture and there's inulin in there. I don't know, for me personally, myself, that I taste something and I'm like, ooh, taste all that inulin. But like if you make burdock tincture and you shake it up and it's all milky and then it settles and that milky layer settles down to the bottom and there's a lot of it, then you can see that the inulin is in there. There's some constituents probably that we just can't really easily and readily taste for. And I think most, grassroots herbalists, we don't necessarily have the equipment to tell that we've got, this many milligrams of this and, in a bottle of that. So we might be wrong sometimes about some things. We might overestimate or we might underestimate certain constituents. But I think in general, if we use our senses, we can make good and potent remedies. And that is what I use to assess the potency of mine. Question: who do I go for health advice? It really depends on what's going on. There are so many people that know things that I don't know well, and I will often think like, oh, this is going on. Who do I know who is like really good at this topic or this issue? And that will be the person that I contact, whether they're a doctor or another herbalist or a naturopath or a body worker or, like another friend who's had experience with something. So there's a lot of that I do is, think like, who do I know who's especially knowledgeable in a given area, and can I talk to them? It helps that I am really quite extroverted and I just know a ton of people. That gives me the ability to do that. I totally get that not everyone can just call up someone who knows about that. But that's what I do. Question: I feel the spaces surrounding herbalism are being infiltrated by a plethora of self-described herbalists. What do you personally do to ensure the information and guidance you are using is from qualified, endorsed, and recognized sources? I have to start this off by saying that I am absolutely a self-described herbalist. I have no formal training of any kind. I've never completed a course on herbalism that assessed my progress in any kind of way. So I am one of those people. Factor that in however you want. Relevant to what you're asking, if I'm looking around at information, like let's say, one of the things that I do when I talk to people is I often find I might say oh, I would consider using this plant. And I might include a link that has information on that plant. And if the plant were, say, mullein, I could link to my write-up on my website about mullein, and that would be good. And if the plant is like yellow dock, and I'm like, oh, I don't have an accessible to anyone document on yellow dock that I can just send to someone, I will, Google, I will think whether someone that I know has one and look around for that. But I might just Google around and be like, does someone have an article on yellow dock that says that, it might be good for soft stool. And so I'll type into Google yellow dock Rumix crispus herbal soft stool and see if anything comes up. And if I find something, I'll read through it. And if I don't know who the person is, I will look at everything that's in the article and be like, what do I think about that article? Do I feel like that covers the bases well, or maybe, not so well? Is there anything in there that I'm like, because that occasionally happens. I don't have to agree with everything. and people can have different opinions from me, but I'll read over the article and see if there's anything that I feel like is like, oh yeah, I can't recommend that because it says that or has that in there. That occasionally happens. And then I'll look and see if I can find an about page on that person's website, try and figure out who they are as I'm reading their website. Because I've done a lot of study over a course of a lot of years, I can tell in a lot of cases, like, are they writing this article from their personal experience using the plant? Or are they just compiling information from a whole bunch of different sources? So if every sentence says, like, this other person said this and this other person said that and this other person said that, that's not necessarily bad, but I'll want to, like, you know, look through it better and see what it says. If I see a bunch of just stuff, and especially stuff I've not seen before, I kind of think about it in relation to how I know that plant and be like, does that seem reasonable to me? And occasionally I'm like, oh wow, this is brilliant, I really like, you know, what this person said about, like, sassafras, because I didn't think of that or say that, and, you know, reading that, it makes me think it's really good. So it's just to explore something, you know, maybe see if they say who they studied with, how do they phrase things. One of the things that I look for is a lot of people, when they write about plant, they'll say, like, this plant does this, or this plant does that, or will do this. And I really prefer when people phrase things with, like, this plant can and this plant may, so that things aren't phrased in absolutes. You know, like, if you take this, it will do this. That sort of denies the uniqueness of the individual people taking it and their experience. So there's just a whole bunch of different ways that I'll, like, pick apart and think. I also might be, like, asked some people that I know, like, oh, hey, you know, do you know this person? Is there any kind of connections? And there doesn't need to be. Like, the resources don't need to meet all of my criteria, but I do really look things over and try to suss out, like, how I feel about the way that it's conveyed and where it's coming from, before I will pass it on to other people, or before I would necessarily, like, quote it in a class or in a write-up or something. I have been known to, like, occasionally contact people and be like, hey, you know, I read this, blah, 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 and ask them some further questions about it. I've done that to other people. Sometimes I call people up on the phone. People don't do that much anymore, but I occasionally still do that. People did that to me. I remember when I was first, started posting a lot on herbal email listservs. In particular, Henriette Kress has an herbal email listserv, I think just called the Herbalist. It's still around now, but not well used after the whole Facebook takeover of everything. And I used to have on my emails my phone number. I don't know if that's something I would totally recommend, but I used to have it on there. And one day my phone rang, and I pick up the phone, and I'm like, hello? And this voice says, hi, Jim. It's Michael Moore down in New Mexico. And I was just like, and I would love to tell you that I was, like, really cool and even keel about it, but I think I was a little bit like, oh my God, Michael Moore is calling me. Holy shit. I think that might have come through a little bit. He was calling me because I was posting stuff, and I think that he wanted to, like, know through talking with me whether I was just good at writing stuff or whether I actually knew stuff and had experience with it. And that's okay. Like, we don't want to be judgmental about people and, like, sizing them up in a, like, you're good or you're bad kind of way, but sort of, like, reaching out to people through various means and connecting with them to get a sense of who they are. To me, that's important. And I always feel like when I look at herbal resources, if I get a sense of someone's personality through the way that they write, as opposed to, like, people who write in a very objective way that gives no sense of their personality, for me personally, I prefer that information about herbs and herbalism is conveyed with a sense of personality. It just clicks better for me. Question. What is your vision or dream for the future of herbalism or herbal medicine in the United States? My dream would be greater integrated inclusivity of all kinds of different herbalists. Genders, cultures, races, approaches, right? And I think I said in an earlier question that I don't think it needs to be like this homogenized mush where you take all the different traditions and then you make them into like a more soupy Western herbalism. And I feel like when I'm exposed to traditions that are different than the primarily Western tradition that I utilize, I don't just add that into the way that I do things, but it gives me a new way to think about things that's different, right? And I think that we should all be trying to think like, oh, I think about this thing like this, and other people think about it differently. And it's not a question of like, this way is right, or this way is better, and that way is wrong, and that way is worse. Sometimes that might be true, but a lot of times it's like, this is just a different perspective seen from a different viewpoint of a different population of people. And the more that we can see that expressed, the more that we can all learn from that. And we, again, don't need to integrate it into like, a mush Western herbalism that takes everything from all the other traditions. But we might do something like to say like, oh, I, as the Western herbalist into European folk medicine and old Mediterranean/Greek medicine and eclectic and physiomedicalism primarily, that's my approach. I might be working with someone and say like, oh gosh, I love humoral temperament so much, but that person is so intensely picture perfect Vata, an Ayurvedic dosha constitution. And like, do I know enough to sort of like address that from my perspective, or do I feel like it's a good fit? Or might I say like, you know what? I think someone from working within an Ayurvedic tradition might be a better fit for you, and just like send someone along to someone that might fit them better or work with them better. I'd really like to see that. I'd really love to see greater representation of more points of view and more experiences become the norm in herbal medicine in the U.S. and all over. Next question. What is your favorite herb that you use most often? And I feel like I've done this a couple times, and now being asked maybe a third time, I'm not really keeping track, but I think a third time, I can just say a third herb. Plantain, a vulnerary, which I think of as being a tissue healer, right? Plantain, like, helps to heal tissues, especially the skin and mucosa. I guess I don't necessarily think of plantain as like a tissue healer for the endocrine tissues, or a tissue healer for like cardiovascular tissue. Maybe I'm just not thinking broadly enough about it. But I think like skin and mucosa, that's a lot of tissues in your body, so plantain is pretty awesome. There's a lot of different ways you can do stuff with it. Question. In your opinion, what is the most versatile herb that you have used personally and would highly recommend due to its versatility? Ooh, I get to pick another one. How about mullein? There's mullein flowers, there's mullein leaves, there's mullein roots. I've got a long-winded monograph on mullein that covers a lot of its different parts on my website, herbcraft.org. That's the free one that's got a whole bunch of free articles, but doesn't look as good on your phone. But there's a good mullein monograph on there. Question. What herbs and practices do you recommend to improve focus? Seriously, I wrote this far, got distracted by something, and now half an hour later I returned to this page, surprised that this email is still incomplete and unsent. Send help. I was going to say, to improve focus and a centered feeling. I have felt tempted lately to ask my doc about ADD medication, but I really feel that with herbs and meditation, I could find a more lasting, helpful path to help me. People can have trouble focusing in different ways. So if you are thinking about something, or you have an idea, or you have a thought, and then... What? Oh, it's gone. Like, if your thought disappears into, like, a cloudy, brain foggy haze, I think about, like, aromatic plants, Calamus, which I primarily use by having people chew it or chewing it myself, Damiana, rosemary, there are lots of others, basil, holy basil. Those kind of plants make sense. But if your mind is like a ball pit full of ferrets, where like one thought jumps to another, and then 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 you can't remember where you started from, I might think about milky oats for that. Omega-3 essential fatty acids, magnesium, and other essential nutrients are really important foundationally in this presentation as well. Could be helpful to look into humoral temperaments. You might be sanguine like me. That doesn't mean you have to be imbalanced. There can be a balanced presentation of sanguine and an imbalanced presentation of sanguine. But it might be like a way to think about framing your tendencies as like a constitutional disposition that can either be balanced or imbalanced, rather than as like just a learning disability, which, you know, works for some people. To me, I find it a little bit less empowering.
All right, just going to interrupt the show real quick to let you know that HerbRally is also an Herbalism events board. Since 2015, we've been listing Herbalism events from around the United States, and we actually even list international Herbalism events. But to find all Herbalism events, you could go to herbrally.com/events. And there you can search for events chronologically. There's also a button that you could click on and search for events by state. So you could just sort by state and find Herbalism events, as we say, in your neck of the woods. If nothing's happening around you, we also list virtual events. To find those, you'd go to herbrally.com/virtual. And there you'll find the list of Herbalism virtual events, and those are listed chronologically as well. So one more time, to find in-person events, go to herbrally.com/events, or check out the virtual events at herbrally.com/virtual. All right, that's enough from me. Back to the show. Enjoy.
Question. If you could only save one medicinal plant, what would you choose? One? Oh my God. I think I would be paralyzed with indecision, trying to figure out what one I would choose at the expense of not choosing other, and the responsibility of that and the ethical implications, and I would feel kind of paralyzed and not be able to answer it. Sorry. Question. Is there ever a place in life for modern medicine, or is eating our weeds the answer? So a few years ago, and this is oversimplified, but let's say my heart kind of exploded, like there was literally a hole in it. And I was in the hospital for months and in a coma, and like really, really legit was like, and not even like almost died, but like I was dying. So I'm going to say there's definitely a place for modern medicine. Question. Are there any herbs that can help with kidney failure? So the most responsible answer to this is that kidney failure is really serious and really complicated. And it's probably like not the right kind of thing to do, to say like, oh, you have kidney failure? Take this herb. And what we would want to do is say like, you really need to find a knowledgeable practitioner who has some experience, who can look at the whole situation and like make recommendations that are based on all of the fine details and nuance and variables. That's absolutely the way to go. But I think we can also say, while you're doing that, look into the use of nettle seed. And if you type into the internet nettle seed and serum creatinine, I think you can pull up a PDF file It's not on his site anymore, but it was written by Jonathan Treasure, that talks about nettle seeds' use as a kidney trophorestorative to improve kidney function in the face of kidney failure. Now, this answer is not like just take nettle seed. It's while you're looking and trying to find someone, to look at the larger picture and all of the fine details, look into nettle seed and maybe consider like adding that as a part of a larger course of action that you engage in. Question. Of all the herbalism books on the market, what are the top 5 books experienced herbalists would recommend for the beginning herbalist? Again, 5? Seriously? 5? I want to say that this is complicated by the fact that not everyone who I think would be wonderful to learn from has written books. And also that I am going to have to like leave out some books I'd recommend to keep it at 5 because, yeah, I'm totally only going to say 5 books. I would totally recommend Body into Balance by Maria Noel Groves. I love that book. It's one of the most beautiful herb books. I feel like it is a more modern and recent book that is similar to the book that was so important to me, David Hoffman's New Holistic Herbal or Complete Holistic Herbal or like Complete Illustrated Holistic Herbal or Guide to the Complete Illustrated Holistic Herbal. There was a whole bunch of it was basically the same book with different titles. But this one is a little bit more recent and it covers energetics and it really is just a spectacular book. Very solid, and it's about herbalism more than like just like the uses of herbs. So spectacular book, Body into Balance by Maria Noel Groves. Wild Remedies by Rosalie de la Forêt and Emily Hahn is another great book. It is not a book about energetics, but there's an energetic lens. It's all there in the presentation of the stuff. And I really think that it's one of the great books if you want a book that has like a bunch of plants in it and then, you know, what their virtues are and how you might make use of them in your practice. Also filled with phenomenal recipes. Especially the one with like the hawthorn blueberry cider reduction. Oh my God, that recipe is spectacular. Who could it possibly have come from? You'll want a book on herbal medicine making and the modern herbal dispensatory by Thomas Easley and Stephen Horn is certainly a very good book to consider there. We could also think about Richo's Making Plant Medicine or James Green, The Herbal Medicine Maker's Handbook. So like a book on making stuff. I'm a Western herbalist. I have a strong inclination towards European folk medicine, and a book that I go back to all the time and just find cool stuff in there is A Modern Herbal, volumes 1 and 2. It's like A through H and then I through Z or something like that, by Maud Grieve. That's just like, to me, an herbal classic if you're a Western herbalist and worth having around. And then, let's just think books that were really important to me. Medicinal Plants of the Pacific West by Michael Moore, I feel like is such a good herb book. And even though I live in the Great Lakes bioregion, and this is like the Pacific West, so many of the plants that he covers in that book exist in my bioregion that I don't feel like the fact that it's outside of my region makes it inaccessible. And reading Michael Moore's writing is just really enjoyable. Like, to me, I like the way he writes. And then also / The Book of Herbal Wisdom by Matthew Wood. That book was just really, really super important when I was learning. It opened my mind up, and I loved the way that Matt like pulls from so many different directions and so many different approaches to herbalism, and, you know, integrates them and blends them together. And especially like when you read that book, there's a bunch of things that some people might consider like spiritual aspects of herbs, but they're in no way separated from the physiological aspects of herbs. They're all like one and the same and tied together. And I think that is just like so incredibly cool to do that and not separate them. And yes, that was more than 5 books, so I cheated again. But that's just what you get when you deal with me. Question. How has herbalism and using herbs in your practice deepened your relationship to the earth and sourcing plants in a respectful way? Alternatively, how have you incorporated sustainability, reducing plastic, less plastic, reducing waste, intentionally sourcing of herbs into your practice? So, a few different things. I wildcraft a lot of what I use, and I know that a strong case can be made about the impact of wildcrafting, especially depending on where you live, what your natural resources are, how many other people are wildcrafting, and especially what you're wildcrafting. I use a lot of weeds. I use a lot of non-natives. I use invasive plants when I can. It doesn't mean that I never harvest native plants. Goldenrod is a native plant. It's really abundant. I'm really mindful of how I harvest things, even if they're not at-risk plants, even if they're widely not seen as being something you need to be mindful about in an ecologically responsible way. I feel like if we wait to think about when things are at risk or on the United Plant Savers to watch list, or legally threatened or endangered, or just sensitive. Like if we wait until they get to that point and then we're like, ooh, we really need to think about sustainability, we're failing, right? We have to think about ethics and sustainability as a forethought and not an afterthought. And we need to do that before plants get to a point where it's an issue. So there's that, but I use a lot of, what grows around me. And so that means that there's like less shipping, less sort of like travel and transport and, less stuff happening to it before it gets to me. I don't really use much in the way of plastics. Most of the stuff I have is in glass. Lids and lid liners are definitely problematic, right? I don't know how to get past a lot of the plastic on the tops of dropper bottles, let's say. So there's that, and I guess I just have to own up to that being a problem. I have some plastic bottles, but really, I don't use plastic bottles very much. Mostly I'm trying to reuse plastic bottles. What else? I replant seeds, not just on my property, but out into the larger habitat. I do root divisions. I get plants and grow them and put them in other places. I've planted ginseng in not just my backyard, but in a lot of parks in the area. When I purchase certain plants like golden seal or black cohosh from growers, like organic herb growers, I usually buy more than I need to make tinctures or oils or salves with. And for example, with like golden seal or black cohosh, when I'm processing the fresh roots, if I see a good shoot on something, I'll put it off to the side and then I'll take it somewhere and plant it, right? So that way I can support organic herb growers who are lessening the impact of use of these plants and be planting the plants back out into their native habitat when I can. So those are some of the things that I think that I do. And I would just say that if you use certain plants, think about whether you can, think about what you can do to perpetuate them. So if you're using invasive or non-native plants, those are probably plants that you don't want to be planting back out into the wild in your habitat. But if there are, native plants you buy, or you are buying plants that are at risk or have, sustainability issues, think about saying how can I be giving back and not just taking in the use of this plant. Question. When did you first feel validated as an herbalist? I've been dabbling into herbal medicine for ages, and I'm currently undergoing more formal education, but still struggling with naysayers and self-doubt. So do your best to avoid naysayers. They're always going to be around. I personally think it's too commonly tolerated for more experienced herbalists to be down on beginning herbalists just because they're still beginning herbalists. I totally do get 100% that there are people who are giving oversimplified and reckless information around health issues. I totally get there are people who are promoting irresponsible and unsustainable use of plants and everything. And that's not great. That's bad. But I think that in a lot of cases, it's just as easy to give encouragement and direction and alternative ways. Like you can address the situation in a way that swings the conversation or the presentation of issues in a certain way without having to be a naysayer or to diss the other person. If I think about my experience, I really benefited back in the days of Henriette's Old Herbalist, to bring that up again, that there were herbalists like Paul Bergner and like Michael Moore and like Henriette Kress on there. I'm leaving other people out, that were established. And, if I responded with something that was maybe like more simplistic, like, listing my favorite antispasmodics for menstrual cramps, and then, Paul Bergner posted on it, he didn't say like, hey, Jim McDonald, that's really irresponsible to be, suggesting antispasmodics for menstrual cramps rather than starting with thinking about whether magnesium deficiency was, is at play. He would just make another thread and say like, a lot of issues around menstrual cramping may have their roots in magnesium deficiency, and we need to think about that before we just suggest antispasmodics. There was no need to, throw in a diss along with that. So that's something that I think we can do. That's something that I think that we can think when we see something online or in person in a class and we're like, I don't know quite what I think about the way that was presented, or that didn't include this and that didn't include that. We can think like, how can I interject that concept or that idea or my experience with this into the discussion without overstepping or without having to sort of diss the other people? I started teaching classes maybe 3-ish years to beginning my informal study of herbalism. And now sometimes people that I know, people who are my friends, will say things like, that person's out there and offering classes and they don't know enough. And I just think I didn't know enough when I started teaching. And it was actually the act of teaching. It was the act of teaching is what gave me the experiences. It's what gave me enough connection to other people and gave me the opportunities to use herbs that grew my experience. So now I do know stuff. And I think the key factor here is teaching or suggesting or practicing within reasonable scope of experience. So beginning herbalist, suggesting chamomile or mint for digestive distress. That's totally cool. If someone's like, oh, but I have ulcerative colitis, you wouldn't say just take chamomile it's anti-inflammatory and it helps to, with infections, and it helps to heal tissues, and it's soothing, and that's all you need to do. That would be like borderline where we get into irresponsibility. But we want to think about that. I started teaching, like 3 years into it. And, sometimes when I say to people, when they're like, oh, this person's doing this, I'm like, I did that too, right? And I might occasionally hear like, oh yeah, but you're different. And I am not different. I'm not. I mean, I'm a different person, obviously, but I'm not different. Like, I just use my experience teaching to grow my knowledge. And over time, slowly over time, my knowledge grew. And now generally, I think at least a bunch of people seem to think positively of me. And it's because of the way that I learned. And the way that I learned was through teaching early on. So it's not necessarily bad. Don't let people be down on you. If they're like, hey, you presented something like this and you really kind of missed out on this or missed out on that, think about it. Think about whether that's a valid explanation, or we need to think about that and then integrate it into the way you're doing things. But don't just let people be naysayers to you or to other people, and try not to be a naysayer if you can actually be someone who's more supportive. This goes back to the way that I was treated by Rosemary and Christopher Headley and so many other people. We can support each other rather than being critical of each other, and that should be our first course of action if we can. Question. What is the most significant story about a health issue you help solve for someone using your knowledge of herbal medicine? This is sort of like the favorite herb question. What is to be the most significant? Maybe, personally, the most significant one is when I first got into herbs, I helped my girlfriend, who's now my wife, largely resolve her chronic sinusitis. I don't think, though, that's the only reason she married me. Probably didn't hurt. Question. What does the herbalism industry need most right now to evolve positively besides more herbalists? I don't know that this is ever going to happen, but my answer to that question would be a cottage herbalist exemption to the GMPs, the good manufacturing processes, kind of modeled after the cottage food laws that allows people to make foods in their home kitchens to sell at farmers markets. I feel if we had something like that, that applied to grassroots herbalists, it would really enrich the field of herbalism and really provide lots of opportunity for people that want to do small scale community herbalism and make stuff available to their community, but feel intimidated and overwhelmed by the immensity of the impact of the GMPs applied to small herbal manufacturers. So if that's someone's good at legal stuff and you want to do that, that would be great. Question. Did you realize that herbalism was a greatly entrepreneurial field when you decided to pursue it? Totally not at all. But it totally is. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, not just knowing herbalism and making stuff. If you do that, it's a lot of work keeping track of things and scheduling things and marketing and, to some degree, letting people know, who you are and what you do. You can approach that work in different ways. Maybe some of things make things more stressful and some things make things less stressful, but there's a lot to think about and do that I think a lot of people don't really realize when they get into it. They're like, this is my passion. There is more than that. One of the things, I'm going to just add in, this is totally not in the written thing. So one of the things that comes along with it is somehow you end up with 100,000, that's an exaggeration, inboxes. It's I've got my email, And then there's like the Facebook messaging thing. And then if you're on Instagram or any other thing, they have their own little messaging thing. And then like the thing that has all my online classes on it has its own little like chat box. And then there's another email thing with that. It's just a lot of things to look at. People have voicemails and people text people. Oh my God, don't text me. I probably won't respond to a text. No offense or anything. That's where I draw the line. When teaching a group, how do you handle someone who questions the material that you're teaching? I think it depends on how it's done. Ideally, you want to respond nicely, because I personally don't think that yelling at or being rude to or dismissive or condescending to students is ever a good strategy to employ. There are clearly people who differ with that, but I'm not into that. Hear out what they have to say. Let them say what they have, acknowledge it. You might not agree with it, and in which case you can say like, okay, so you said that. I don't know that that's quite how I see it. And then you could like move on and say, how you see it. But I mean, being open-minded, there will come a time when you're teaching something and then someone says something and they've got a better handle on it than you do. So you want to be open to that. It's never my goal in teaching to convince the people there that what I think is right. I know that other people, that is their goal. Like I have the information and other people have wrong information, and I'm teaching to correct that information. But my strategy is really much more basically like, I have a certain way that I think about plants, and I think about herbalism, and I think about health conditions. And what I'm going to do is present that to you, and then you can take it and adapt it how you need to adapt it to make it work for you. And the best people to take my classes are people who feel like the way that I teach works for them, right? And I have tweaked what I have learned from other people. I learned important concepts from other people, and some of them are very foundational to the way that I use herbs nowadays. But over the course of time, I've tweaked them to my own preferences and my own inclinations, and they work better for me. And it's not because the other people were wrong. I'm just doing, what that is. And so now, when I am teaching and people say something and don't agree with me, I'll hear them out. I'll let them say their piece. It is still my class, right? I'm not going to let someone take over. I'm not going to let someone derail it. And occasionally someone will say something that is like, no, that's not okay to say in my class. I once had someone, declare in a class that, you can't give little boys anything with soy because it'll make them gay. And I just had to like shut that down. That is 100% not true. End of discussion. Not going there. So you might have to do that. I don't like having to be blunt like that. Times arise. But in general, what I want to do is, let people say what they think. And then I can say like, oh, okay, you see it that way. That's not quite how I see it. Let's move on to the rest of my class. This is an add-on for people who are listening. There's a place that I teach maybe every, 3 or 4 years. It's this little annual conference on a topic that I won't mention. So as to protect identities and not be, telling a story about someone that they might not like. There's this person who, when I teach at this thing every 3 or 4 years, has to sit up in the front of class. And like they just wait for their chance to be like, oh yeah, but, and then they contradict me very publicly in front of everyone. I think like, that's kind of like not awesome. I don't really enjoy that. But I'll usually just let that person say what they think, and then I will say what I think, and let other people resolve the differences there. Certainly can be a bummer. Question. As for measuring herbs for teas, how much herbs would I measure for a recipe with chamomile flowers and holy basil for a gift bag for multiple cups? I want to put together a few great tea treats for gifts. Thinking chamomile flowers and holy basil would be good for the immune system and belly. Hope it makes sense. That sounds like a great formula. This is the way that I would do it, totally honestly, is I would get like a big bowl, maybe a big glass Pyrex bowl, or I've got this really large, deep kind of metal bowl I like mixing dried herbs for tea in, and I would pour some chamomile into it, and then I would pour some holy basil into it, and then I would stick my hands in, clean, washed, ideally. If you're giving it to other people, definitely wash your hands. And I would mix up the herbs together, and then I would like take my hands out of it, and I would step back a little bit, and I would look at the bowl, and I would say, does it need more yellow? And if it did, I'd add more chamomile. And I was like, does it need more green? Then I would add more holy basil, or tulsi if you call it that. And then once I thought it looked right, I'll pull some out and I'll make tea with it, and then I'll let the flavor decide for me. And that's absolutely and totally how I would do it. I would 100% eyeball it. And that's how I cook too. Like if I'm making, bone broth or something, I know I have a recipe on my site that has like measured amounts of stuff, but that's totally not how I cook it. I like chop up a bunch of carrots and throw it in, and then stir it around and like look how much orange is floating in, and then think like, does it need more orange? And then I'll add more, and then I do that with the celery and with the garlic and with the onions and with all the other stuff. So that's my way of doing it. Other people might do it differently, but I'm an eyeballer when it comes to mixing together proportions of herbs in a formula. Question. What herb do you think is the most valuable to use regularly, and why? I get to think of a new answer. How about instead of saying a specific herb, I'm going to give a kind of herb and say bitters. And by bitters, I mean both leafy green bitter vegetables and bitter herbs, and especially yummy, ideally kind of yummy blends of bitter herbs and aromatic herbs in the form of herbal formulas or extracts we call collectively bitters, even though they have aromatic herbs. Because they're just wonderful, and bitters are so commonly deficient in people's diets. And if you want to know why, you type in Jim McDonald and bitters into the internet, and I have an article called Blessed Bitters, and you can look up, and that's my long exposition on that topic, because it'd be too much to get into right now. Question. As a newbie herbalist, what is the most important action I can take to learn, promote, and live an authentic herbalist life? Being an herbalist means different things to different people. But what I would say is make relationships with and tend to the land that surrounds you in whatever way you're able to. That feels pretty solid to me. Question. My big question is how to get your business set up, going and growing. Like business forms and licensing needed, straightforward information. I am totally not the best person to answer that question. Sorry. So that is a good question for some people. It's a great question, but business forms and everything, that's stuff I struggle with already too. Question. My question would be, what 5 herbs would you consider vital for their ability to address multiple health issues that every person should have in their apothecary? So some overlap with previous iterations of this question, but how about I say plantain as a vulnerary tissue healer, milky oats as a nervous system troporestorative, marshmallow as a cover all the bases demulcent, orange mint, my personal favorite mentha species, and dandelion as a bitter. Ask me again, I would come up with different herbs, but that's what I'm going to say for right now. Question. If you are already inspired by plants, herbs, mushrooms, and their healing properties, how do you portray this excitement to other people in your life so that they too will understand the joy of herbal healing, but also believe you when you tell them about the healing properties of plants? So for me, the way that I do this is I offer just a lot of herb walks, like plant walks, herb walks. They probably comprise most of the classes that I do here locally. Really, spring, summer, and fall, almost all the open classes like to the community that I teach are herb walks, because that's what I love doing. Being out in the woods or fields or swamps or bogs is where I love being. And it's a great place to see people really get turned on, because you're talking to them about plants and they're seeing them where they're at. And a lot of times they're like, I know this plant. Like, I recognize this plant. I walk by this plant on, at the park that I go to, or this plant is growing in my backyard. And seeing that connection is really, really great. It's also a big reason that I not only use a lot of weeds, but teach a lot of weeds. Because if I teach a lot about a lot of different weeds that are just growing outside people's houses, the immediacy and connection is sort of like enhanced compared to like if I teach them a plant that grows out at a park that maybe is not near them and that they never see in their, regular weekly life. So to me, seeing people get turned on by plants is like the greatest thing, and herb walks is like the greatest thing to do that. Question: did you choose this path, or did this path of an herbalist choose you? Yeah, it was totally the plants. I think were like, ooh, we can really make some good use of that one, and happily so. Question: what experience in your life motivated you towards herbal medicine over allopathic medicine? I usually use the word conventional medicine over allopathic. The actual origins of allopathic medicine come from homeopathy. And other people have used it different ways, but the origins of allopathic medicine come from homeopathy. And homeopathy said, we do homeopathy, like treats like. And allopathy, or allopathy, is balance something with its opposite. So something's hot, use something cold. And that's actually energetic herbalism. And so, I use the word conventional medicine. I think the term allopathic has some other meanings that kind of confuse it. But to answer the question, plants are they're just more interesting, and they're definitely a lot prettier than tablets of stuff. We have the absolutely most beautiful form and tradition of medicine that exists. Question: what was the turning point, the catalyst, the light that directed you to the dedicated path of learning, absorbing, and being skilled in the provision of medicinal herbs? And I think that it's the endless awe that I have for nature, and that herbalism is an expression of nature, and it's an expression of interdependence, right? So sometimes people talk about everything is interdependent on each other, and ecosystems are interdependent. And when we think about herbalism and the actual use of herbs, it is an example of this interdependence in action. And that leaves me feeling a sense of wonder and awe. Question: what advice do you wish you had as an herbal student? There's a lot of different things I could say, but let's choose this. The study of herbalism is not a contest. It's not a competition. It's not a race. And that if you can approach the study of herbalism and take your time and learn at your own pace, and know that you don't need to know everything, and that you don't need to compare what you know and how you do things and how you know things to the way other people, do things and know things and how they know things. Our herbalism is an art. The way we practice herbalism, the way that we create formulas, is a form of creative expression. Knowing that you don't know is still knowing. That's all, I think, really good foundational stuff to have in your head when you're just starting. And then the other thing would be to practice and teach within the scope of your knowledge where you're at. Question. I would probably ask them a question about dreaming with plants. There is a legend that you were initiated into herbalism when you were visited in your dreams by a plant. I'd be curious which one, if any, not gatekeeping. I've dreamed about plants, but not in this way. I think that there's a lot of different ways that people are called to plants. And mostly, if somebody is a plant person, that part of them will wake up and really be a driver for them once they're exposed to plants, and it'll pull them in and along their path. Question. I am new to herbalism as a practice. I'm starting with the master plant Cannabis indica. She definitely has lessons for me. I feel like I used to understand cannabis so much better than I do now. There's so much hybridization and strains, and the plant seems more and more to be rarely grown in actual soil with actual sunlight. And there's all of these high this constituent strain and high that constituent strain that I just really haven't kept up with it. And it's hard for me to speak generally about cannabis, even saying cannabis indica versus cannabis sativa. I'm just not up with it. I know that Tammy Sweet is spectacular on this topic. And so if someone was really wanting to know more about cannabis, I would feel confident saying look into Tammy Sweet. She's cool. I also hear, and I haven't been in one of Tammy Sweet's classes, I hear that she is just a great teacher. I would add that there is no denying that cannabis is a plant that inspired many herbalists to get deeper into plant medicine. Question. I wonder what the best way is to add or blend. Feeling conflicted about merging properties, considering hops or valerian, but I'm literally paralyzed about how or if I can merge these essences. To me, it's not as simple as just creating a blend. We need to be in balances with these plants. I'm sure that sounds bizarre to you. I'm stumped, mired in the weeds, LOL. I could go on. When I think about formulation, I think about it a lot like cooking. And we blend herbs and spices and flavors and smells. And with that, all of the phytochemicals that go along with that every time that we cook. So some things make all the sense in the world and they taste divine. You mix chocolate and blueberries together. Ugh. You mix tomatoes and basil together. And then other things, you had a really good cheesecake and you put ketchup on it. Ooh, that just sounds not okay to me. Yeah, there's probably someone who's I could do that, but I think a lot of people are yeah, that's not okay. That just, that doesn't seem to work. You could probably take ketchup and cheesecake and come out with some way on paper to say this could make sense and everything. But I think that when you're thinking about creating blends, you have to have a sense of the plants individually to understand how to blend them well. rather than just knowing stuff about them. If you just know stuff about plants, it's really easy to think like, oh, I'll just combine this plant and that plant together. And they may actually, when combined together, be the herbal equivalent of ketchup on cheesecake. So let flavor, let taste, let smell guide you. And I also think that as you learn more about some of the herbal actions that are really tied to energetics, like astringents and demulcents and aromatics and bitters, that can help you understand how to make a good formula as well. Question. If you could only have the use of one herb, which would it be and why? This time, I'm going to say that I could linger for a really, really long time, blissed out by the virtues and qualities of kava kava. I love that plant. Question. How do you absorb it all and keep it absorbed? There's so much information, and even if I feel like I've memorized it, when I need to, I can't seem to remember it all. This has kind of been covered in other questions, but I'll say that I often, not always, feel like the things that I absorb and retain the most are the things that are the most relevant to me. If it's connected to something, that I've experienced or have experienced with another person, that really makes something stay in me. If it's like just an isolated piece of information about something that I've never applied, it's a lot harder for me to have that. And we don't need to remember everything. It's totally okay to have stuff that's like not at top of mind that you need to look up all the time. Not all of us are living encyclopedias. I know there are some people that seem like living encyclopedias, but that's like their gift. And they may not be able to do something else that you can do. So we want to use more than our brain when we're learning, and our thinking and our intellectual, deductive reasoning. If, for example, you're trying to learn herbal actions and you're thinking to yourself, astringents tone and tighten tissues and lessen secretion. Astringents tone and tighten tissues and lessen secretions. Astringents tone and tighten tissues and lessen secretions. Astringents tone and tighten tissues and lessen secretions. That's good. And eventually you'll remember that, phrase, that definition, which of course could be expanded for another half hour. But if along with doing that, you're like, I'm going to eat a 2-grain banana and feel astringency in my mouth. I'm going to eat an underripe strawberry and feel a different, milder kind of astringency in my mouth. And I'm going to drink like strong black or green tea and feel a different kind of astringency in your mouth. And like, I'm going to make strawberry leaf tea and feel a much milder astringency in your mouth. Then all the stuff you know about astringency can be tempered with a sort of like experiential understanding of astringency. And if you do that, it's easier to recall information because it's not just mental information you're recalling, it's information that's attached to a visceral experience. Or if there is a story or some kind of like experience that happened to you that you can tie in with a concept, it's easier. You can just remember the story or the person that the story is about, and then all of the details of the concept come along with that story. That's how I remember things a lot. Let's see. Question. As an herbalist, how can you best address climate change and global warming? I think that favoring the use of local plants so that you're not needing to ship stuff from across the country or the world is helpful. I think that especially if you're using a lot of weedy plants, that's really important. And then especially plant stuff, plant plants, plant trees, plant shrubs, get more stuff happening. That's like actions we can take that aren't only addressing global warming, but are helping to restore the ecosystems that we live in. Question. How do you, as an herbalist, work on the business side of things? I've probably answered that one as well as I can up above, which is to say, like, there are some things that I look at and I'm not so great at, and then I think to myself, like, I've been able to make this what I do to support my family, so I'm not really being too bad at it. Question. I would like to ask an herbalist, what's your favorite way to introduce children to herbalism? It depends a lot on the child. Some child will be really into it and really drawn to it. Other child, other kids not so much. And that's okay. Like, my kids, I want to say my kids. And that's okay. I'm just picking up here. I might edit this. I might just leave it in. My parents really wanted me to get into drafting and work at General Motors. And I totally didn't. I had no draw to it. And for me, it worked out. So if your kid's not like drawn to herbalism, like, don't maybe push it or force it, because that might create conflict in your relationship. And you probably don't need or want that with your kids. But make yummy stuff for them, as opposed to like, don't have like, oh my God, this bitter is so bad. Here, try this. That might, sort of be something that turns them off. If you're going to give your kids herbs, they should see that you also use herbs. And if you're going to give your kids, herbs that are, because sometimes stuff does taste bad, like, let them know, be like, hey, this is kind of gnarly. You can have a chaser after it, like, just gulp this down and then immediately have this other thing. Like, that's a good strategy for a lot of kids, rather than being like, it's not that bad. Don't ever say that to kids. Mostly, I think herbalists, we've had some of the worst stuff ever. And so when we say it's not that bad, it might be the worst thing the other person has ever tasted, because they haven't had like wormwood decoction or something. There is, via learning herbs, there's the Wildcraft board game. My daughter loves that game. All my kids like that game. There's the Herb Fairies books. Right? So that's kind of like a pretty cool way to introduce herbalism and herbal concepts, and let them see you drinking and taking and using herbs. Go out for walks, spend time, be like, oh, this is the plant here in the garden or here at the park or here in the yard. This is the plant that we made that tea from, so that there's connections. Teach them about things like, if it grows where you live, like plantain for mosquito bites or stings. Definitely teach them how to recognize poison ivy, right? So that not only do they know how to recognize it, but if they go out, with their friends, they can feel like, ooh, don't play there. There's poison ivy there. And then they teach it to their friends, and that makes them feel cool and empowered. While you're doing all of this and thinking of more, for sure, tell them not to eat anything without asking about it. Be like, oh, this is cool, that's cool and everything. If you want to eat something, ask me what it is. Let me confirm what it is before you put it in your mouth. I don't think it works great to just tell kids stuff is poisonous, because kids might not really get the concept of poisonous. One of the things that I've done when I've taught classes for kids is said something to the effect of like, have you ever thrown up? And most kids have by the time I'm talking to them. And they'd be like, yeah. And I'm like, you ever had really bad diarrhea? Again, most kids have. They'd be like, yeah. And I'd be like, I know someone who ate something. They thought it was one thing and it wasn't. And they threw up and had really bad diarrhea at the same time. And all the kids are like, ah! Which is kind of how I feel about it. But that can be helpful because it's something that they can actually relate to. And I'm not saying don't tell kids that some stuff is dangerous or that you could die, but, give them something that is relatable to them. And of course, make them ask you before they consume anything, so that you can be sure that something like is, like a blueberry and not a buckthorn berry, or, something that is, potentially dangerous. Question. I was recently diagnosed with osteopenia. There are too many side effects from taking the prescription drug. What herbs are great for bone health? So osteopenia is a loss of bone mass, and that results in weaker bones. And as I said earlier about a couple different things, there's really more to this, and there's a bunch of potential causes to look into, so it can be addressed at as close to a causal level as possible. And it makes less sense to just say, oh, you have this, just do this. But that said, while you're looking into potential root causes, the first place that I think of going is looking at essential nutrients. And although I think we've all heard like calcium builds strong bones and teeth, and calcium is indeed very important, my general recommendation is mostly try to always get your calcium from foods rather than taking calcium supplements. There's been some evidence linking calcium supplements to calcium getting in places in the body you don't want it to be. A lot of people get enough calcium, but they don't get enough calcium cofactors that get the calcium into the bones. So emphasize omega-3 essential fatty acids, vitamin D3, vitamin K2, magnesium, boron, silica. All these things, again, help get calcium where it needs to go, into your bones. We can also think about mineral-rich herbal infusions, things like oat straw, things like nettles. If you're going to think about horsetail, because everyone says horsetail, I always think like a pinch of horsetail. The other things, like much larger quantities, like even up to like a strong herbal infusion, which is about an ounce of herb per quart of water, steeped for several hours or overnight. If a person is not vegan or vegetarian, I think that bone broth can be really helpful here as well. Question: how do you keep your focus and keep from getting distracted by all the wonders that every piece of plant life has on this planet? So the easiest way to do that is, oh my gosh, the birch trees against the snow here is so pretty, you wouldn't believe it. Question: what is your favorite part of being an herbalist? And what's your big why that keeps you learning and growing? I said this earlier, but basically, nature is amazing. It has limitless awe and provides for endless inquiry. Question: what herbs surprised you? Some years ago, I was sneaking into a Natalie Merchant concert through the dark woods behind the amphitheater, and I was totally surprised by stinging nettle. Question: I would ask what herbs are good for osteoarthritis and the best mechanisms for delivering them into the body by constitution. Definitely more complicated than I can get into just answering these questions. I'm trying to have like largely briefer answers. Hopefully some of them are funny. And although I don't discuss osteoarthritis by name on my website, I do have a bunch of information on the energetic indications for back and joint injuries. And that's herbcraft.org/backpain.html. Or just Google Jim McDonald herbs for back and joint pain. It should probably come up. Question: what is the difference between catnip and catmint? Also, are there any courses or teachers you would recommend who focus on herbalism for tree and animal spirits? I'm pretty sure, if I understand this right, that catnip and catmint are different species, or like a variety, like a hybrid maybe, something like that. This is one of those things that I learn probably every year and promptly forget every year and then have to look at again. And when I wrote this, I said something like, I'm going to be honest, I could have just Googled it and then answered the question after Googling it, but I just wanted to say like, yeah, I never remember. And even after I wrote this and now I'm recording it, I still haven't done that and I still don't know. But I think they're different species or different varieties in the mint family. Pretty solid they're both in the mint family. As for the latter, people I recommend focusing on herbalism for animal and tree spirits. I'm not quite sure, but I went on an herb walk with Kate Gilday where she was just solely talking about trees, and it was awesome. Kate is awesome. I would totally recommend Kate Gilday and see whether she fills that need for you. Question: what is the one herb or herbal product that I always have on hand and would never be without, and why? So I've answered several iterations of kind of this question, and this time I would like to say like an all-purpose salve for like cuts and scrapes and chafes and, bites and stings and minor skin irritations, chapped lips, maybe hemorrhoids. And an all-purpose salve can have all kinds of different ingredients in it, depending on the person and how they put things together. Mine has a bunch of different things. It has a lot of plantain and chickweed in it. That's a good thing to have around. Question: what do you do when you see someone you don't know well dealing with an issue that you're pretty sure you could help with, but they haven't asked for help? This is totally, I think in most cases, a bite your tongue moment. And I would say this even if you do know someone well, even if someone is especially if someone is friends with you and they know what you do and they're not asking. If they're not asking, some people don't want to feel like proselytized to, like an herbalist can do that. So you might do something like let it slip that you're an herbalist to give an opening, but I try really hard not to be like, what you should try is, without people asking me. That's just kind of what I've done. Another thing that often and eventually happens is that someone didn't ask for something and you make something and you create a protocol for them and you give it to them and they don't take it or follow it because they didn't ask. And then it often leaves you feeling frustrated, and then you have to struggle with the ethics of if I gave them that bottle of herbs and they're not taking it and I'm using their bathroom later on and I see it on the counter, is it okay for me to take it back? I don't know the answer to that one, but I've wondered that. Again, for my part, I help people who ask. Question: what is your favorite resource when using herbs? I mentioned some of these above. I want to say again, I absolutely adore Henriette Kress's website, which is rife with eclectic and physiomedical texts. Question: what would an herbalist need in a first aid kit, since I live in Hurricane Valley, New Orleans? So there's something I think everybody needs, some salve in their first aid kit, or some oil for aches and pains, some propolis tincture as a wound dressing. I mentioned that earlier. Probably echinacea belongs in all first aid kits. But another thing to think of is if this is especially for your family, what is the stuff that you need? So if you are a person who gets headaches under stress, you need headache stuff in your first aid kit. If you tend to get sinus infections or upper respiratory issues, you want to have something specific for that. So I always want to think what do I get? What does my family get? If we need to have a bug out bag that has a first aid kit in it, I need not only the cover all the bases stuff, I need the stuff that is for things that I and my family have to deal with. Seven Song on his website, he has a bunch of really phenomenal first aid resources. And on YouTube, there's a whole herbal first aid series that you can watch for free. And he's great, and it's a fun watch. So that's definitely a resource to check out. Question: for someone like me who's just starting out, aside from teas, infusions, and decoctions, what would be the best type of plant medicine to practice making? Teas and water-based preparations are absolutely a mainstay, but if you're not making tinctures yet and you tolerate alcohol, they certainly do come in handy. You can make them in quantity and they last a really long time. They're often quite effective, and they're pretty easy to make. So that's a pretty empowering thing to do. There's also, glycerites and acetums. Acetums are vinegar extracts. Oxymels, which are vinegar honey extracts that you can check out. All those things, they're not... People often present them as being like, oh, I don't like alcohol or can't use alcohol for whatever reason. And so instead of making tinctures, I could make a glycerin tincture or a vinegar tincture or an oxymel or something, and then imply maybe that it's just the same thing. Just because it comes in a dropper bottle and you take it in squirts, that it's the same as a tincture. It's just not have alcohol in it. And that's really not the case. There's often some overlap, but they might not be totally interchangeable. And certain things might not be very well extracted in other solvents. But a big reason to make stuff is just to make a bunch of stuff, because making stuff is fun. Making different things is fun, right? That's part of the fun of being an herbalist. So, get a book on herbal preparations and think about all the different ways you can make stuff and try it out. And when you're trying out new forms of things and you're not quite sure how it's going to turn out and how you're going to like using it, make small batches of stuff to start with. And then see what you think about it before you commit to making a large batch. You don't want to make a half gallon of, an herbal vinegar if you're like, ooh, I really don't like herbal vinegars. Because then you're like, what do I do with it? You have to look for people to pawn off your herbal vinegar on. You'll probably find someone. But, generally experiment in small batches. And when you're like, ooh, I really like this, then increase the quantity of stuff that you make that way. Also, think about things like steams and eye washes or nasal rinses. Think about soaks and onion poultices and herbal baths. Again, so much different ways to make stuff. It's fun. Question. My question to herbalists in general is, now that we have so many people getting into herbalism, how do we keep plants mostly for other species survival and not for human consumption? Over-harvesting is happening at a rapid rate, and to be honest, I don't put up a lot of tinctures or salves because I can't justify my needs over pollinators. I propagate as many plants as possible, and still I can't bring myself to harvest St. John's wort. This is important. There's a whole bunch of different things to think about. Some of the things you could think about would be, I said this earlier, but it's not enough to just know that a certain plant is not threatened or endangered, or that it's not on the United Plant Savers at-risk or to-watch list. We need to know their status in our ecosystems where they live. We need to know what plants are common, what plants aren't, and the best practices to harvest them in all situations, if harvest is appropriate. And so this requires learning some bioregional naturalism in addition to just your herbalism. Also said earlier, sustainable and ethical harvesting needs to be a forethought and not an afterthought. And that means we need to apply sustainable harvesting practices to all the herbs we harvest, and not just to the ones that are on at-risk and to-watch list. If a plant is actually listed as threatened or endangered, you shouldn't be picking it at all. We can't wait until something is in trouble before we start thinking about sustainability. We need to focus a lot on weedy, non-native, and invasive species. We have to both harvest and plant stuff. And we should always remember that it is extremely powerful to support small herbalist-run herb farms, right? So sometimes I hear people say things like, oh, that plant is sensitive or it's not ethical to harvest, we shouldn't use it anymore. And I think oh, we should still use it, but we should use it if we're getting it from sustainable places like small herb farms. Let's use Golden Seal as an example. There are herbalists that run small herb farms growing Golden Seal. And when we purchased Golden Seal from them, we encourage them to keep growing Golden Seal. And a lot of those people don't just grow Golden Seal or what other plants they grow to sell for people to make tinctures and oils and salves and teas with. They're also selling them as plants that people can plant out. And so by supporting them, we're encouraging planting more of those species. And as I said earlier, we can always buy more than we need, especially of like fresh roots in the fall, and then take those root cuttings and plant them out to assist us in cultivating the plants that we use. Question. Oh my goodness, this is the last question. We've finally gotten to the end. Oh, we've finally gotten to the end. What herbs would you recommend for chronic hemorrhoids? Herbal podcasts and blogs I've read cover upper, GI, and general upset that can be directly related to food, but what about the painful, persistent end side of GI problems? So hemorrhoids are often kind of thought of best as both a digestive problem and a vascular problem because they have to do with lack of tone of the blood vessels at the anus. But it's also often aggravated, or at least to some degree caused by maybe straining its stool, right? So think about both different systems. And I tend to use a blend of stone root, Calansonia canadensis, yarrow, and blueberry, maybe with some other stuff depending on the person, internally as a tincture. And then always you want to be doing topical stuff too. And I make a salve that's got stone root and yarrow and witch hazel, maybe some other stuff too, that you can apply topically. So these are base formulas. They could be highly tweakable depending on what else I want to add in. But they're pretty good. Like, those are the things that I use the most often. When you're applying the salve, do it often and liberally. And most importantly, wash your hands after you put it on. So that's the end of the questions. Thank you for the good ones. Jim McDonald, herbcraft.org and herbcraft.podia.com if you want to support me. It's like someone asked earlier. I hope you have a great day. Bye.
And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the HerbRally podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us here at HerbRally, we now have a text message community, believe it or not. Basically, it's just updates from us. We send about 1 to 7 texts per week, notifying you about new events, videos, courses, podcasts. You get the idea. It's pretty much like our email newsletter, just in text form. So if you'd like to receive text messages from HerbRally, just text JOIN, that's JOIN, to the number 541-256-2895. Again, that's JOIN to number 541-256-2895. And to stop receiving texts, that's easy too. Just text STOP to the same number. It'll opt you out immediately. Okay, thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.